Naomi was called to accompany a group of elderly people on a cruise as a private nurse. An unexpected night of celebration led her into the arms of a charming and enigmatic man. Months later, she discovers she is pregnant. When seeking help, she encounters difficulties that ultimately prove worthwhile. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Naomi clutched her worn canvas bag, her fingers tightening around the straps as she waited in line to board the towering cruise ship. The vessel stretched out before her in sleek lines of polished rails and gleaming glass panels. Around her, the buzz of excited passengers blended with the distant cry of gulls. Every step forward brought her closer to the check-in desk, and she hoped, to a moment of peace. She needed this job desperately, and the thought of failure made her heart pound. Ahead of her, a small group of tourists chattered about the countless swimming pools, elegant dining halls, and glamorous late-night parties they expected to find on board. Naomi tried to drown out their excitement, aware that she wasn't here for leisure. She was here to work, and if everything went well, she'd earn enough to cover her sister's overdue tuition fees. That thought forced a tiny smile onto her face. At least she had a purpose. No matter how intimidating the prospect, she would give her best. As she finally stepped onto the gangway, Naomi's pulse quickened. Inside, the grand lobby rose 2 stories high, complete with a luminous chandelier that refracted the overhead lights into rainbow shards on the polished floor. Guests milled around, collecting welcome cocktails and marveling at the ornate decor. Naomi felt a flicker of self-consciousness. Her uniform was plain, only a name tag pinned to the left side of her blouse. Still, she squared her shoulders and quietly reminded herself she had a job to do. Her mission was straightforward. She had been hired to care for a small group of elderly passengers who needed specialized attention. It was a temporary position, but if she did well, maybe it would open doors. She barely had time to admire the decor before a voice called her name from across the lobby. Turning, she saw a short, round-faced woman with lively brown eyes waving enthusiastically from beside a cluster of upholstered chairs. This had to be one of the elderly guests assigned to her care, Mrs. Martha, if Naomi recalled correctly from the list she'd studied earlier. "My dear, look at this place," Mrs. Martha exclaimed, her smile warm and inviting. "You must be Naomi, our nurse, yes?" Naomi nodded and stepped closer. "Yes, I'm Naomi. It's lovely to meet you." "It's lovely to meet you too, child," Mrs. Martha replied, taking Naomi's hands in her own. "I'm so relieved we have a nurse along. The ocean air can do wonders for the spirit, but we older folks sometimes need a bit more than the sea breeze." Her cheerful manner set Naomi at ease. The rest of the group, a handful of older men and women dressed in comfortable resort wear, introduced themselves. One gentleman with a silver cane, who introduced himself as Anselmo, joked about how he was ready to dance the night away despite being well into his 70s. Naomi's lips twitched upward at the idea of Anselmo on a dance floor, swirling to a lively beat. A uniformed coordinator approached, looking somewhat rushed. He gave Naomi a quick nod and explained her responsibilities. Take regular vitals for the elderly passengers under her watch, ensure they attended scheduled activities, and stand by during any potential health emergencies. Though the job description sounded daunting, Naomi's training and passion for caring for others gave her confidence. She signed a few documents, acknowledging her duties, and soon found herself following the group to their cabins. The hallways on the lower decks were wide, lined with soft carpeting and gentle lighting. Naomi noted the cabin numbers for each of her charges. Marta and Anselmo occupied neighboring rooms. Anselmo's door boasted a small nameplate that he had personally taped up, "Anselmo's Hideaway." Naomi smiled at that personal touch. Along the way, the elderly group chattered about how someone really big might be on board. It was apparently a hot topic. Whispers had spread that the actual owner of the luxury ship, or perhaps his family, was doing a discreet inspection. According to rumors, he was rarely seen, preferring to keep a low profile. Naomi, though curious, had too many immediate concerns to dwell on gossip. Not much later, she hurried to the upper deck after hearing that Anselmo had begun climbing an outdoor staircase, determined to see the ship's vantage point himself. The problem was that midday sunshine beat down heavily on the decks, and Naomi worried he might overexert himself. She emerged onto an open-air space with shining wooden floors and teak railings. Warm air brushed her face, carrying the scent of salt water. "Anselmo?" she called, scanning the scene. Many passengers stood leaning over the rails to watch the harbor fade behind them. Then she spotted him, halfway up a short flight of stairs leading to the next deck level. He looked unsteady, weaving slightly on his feet. Naomi broke into a quicker stride, alarm tightening in her chest. She found him gripping the railing, breathing heavily. "Anselmo," she said, pressing a gentle hand to his shoulder. "You should have waited for me. Are you feeling dizzy?" He opened his mouth to answer but couldn't manage more than a weak nod. Naomi steadied him with one arm and quickly reached into her pocket for the small kit she carried, a portable blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope. Before she could wrap the cuff around his arm, another pair of hands arrived to help support him. "Easy there," came a low, calm voice at her side. Naomi glanced over and noticed a tall man with sun-kissed hair and a straightforward expression. He was holding Anselmo's other arm, his stance firm and confident. "I saw him stumbling," the man added softly. "Is he going to be okay?" She offered a grateful smile. "I think so. Let me check his blood pressure." With remarkable composure, the stranger helped guide Anselmo onto a nearby bench. Naomi knelt and swiftly tested the man's vitals, her heart thumping from the sudden rush of adrenaline. Around them, curious onlookers paused, but no one approached. After a moment, she breathed easier as she confirmed that Anselmo's blood pressure was a bit low, but not in the danger zone. Anselmo mumbled a quiet apology, insisting he only wanted to get a better view. Naomi gently patted his shoulder and shook her head. Better safe than sorry. As Anselmo's head cleared, Naomi turned to thank the stranger but paused, suddenly unsure. There was a subtle grace in the way he moved, a kindness in his eyes that made her feel momentarily self-conscious. "Thank you for helping," she said, somewhat breathless from the ordeal. He gave a courteous nod, still hovering close by to ensure Anselmo remained steady. "No trouble at all. I'm just glad I was here in time." His voice was quiet, yet it carried a certain confidence. Naomi found herself observing his demeanor, the way he politely stepped aside to let her work, the gentle but unwavering support he offered. She realized this was no ordinary passenger. Without quite knowing why, she felt his presence put everyone at ease. Eventually, Anselmo stood, leaning on his cane with renewed vigor. He made a light-hearted joke about needing a new heart if he wanted to keep up on this grand cruise. Naomi felt relief wash over her, grateful that the scare had passed. By then, a uniformed staff member bustled over, face pinched with concern. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his tone formal. "It's under control," Naomi said. "A little dizziness, but he's fine now. I'll take him to a cool, shaded area just in case." The staff member glanced at the man who had helped them. He nodded once and seemed ready to speak when the tall stranger caught his eye. An unspoken understanding passed between them. Naomi frowned, sensing tension. But the staff member simply cleared his throat, stepped away, and pointed them to the nearest indoor corridor. Naomi brushed it off as she escorted Anselmo. She thanked the stranger once more, feeling a faint flutter in her stomach when he gave her a polite parting smile. "I'll see you around," he said, then turned to head off in another direction. As he left, Naomi couldn't help noticing that everyone, staff and guests, moved aside for him instinctively. She shoved the observation to the back of her mind. She had a job, and taking care of Anselmo was her priority. A short while later, in the modest staff cafeteria, Naomi sipped a bottle of water, trying to calm her nerves. The room was utilitarian, quite different from the lavish buffet restaurants reserved for passengers. She overheard whispers from a nearby table. Some crew members were discussing the possibility that the rumored owner or heir was on board. Though Naomi tried not to eavesdrop, her ears caught bits of speculation. He's young. He's rarely seen. He likes to keep a low profile. And he's definitely around. She forced herself to focus on the tasks ahead, but the memory of the stranger's calm eyes lingered. A buzz in her pocket broke her line of thought. She pulled out her phone to see her sister's name on the screen, and her stomach knotted. She stepped into a corner to take the call. "Naomi?" Her sister's voice trembled through the connection. "I got another letter from the bursar's office. They're serious about the overdue fees." Naomi closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I promise I'll handle it. This contract on the cruise, I'll have the money after the trip. Just hold on, okay?" Her sister's sigh was laced with worry. Naomi's heart sank at the helplessness in that sound. A wave of guilt washed over her. She wished she could do more immediately, but the job's payment would only clear once she completed her assignment. It was the best she could manage for now. When the call ended, she slumped against the wall and glanced out a nearby porthole. Somewhere beyond the ship's hull, the ocean stretched into the horizon. She checked her watch and noted that her shift would start again soon. She'd have to ensure her group of elderly travelers was settling in. But the conversation with her sister lingered in her mind, adding a weight of urgency to everything. She decided to take a brief walk on the main deck, hoping the fresh air might clear her thoughts. Ascending the stairs to the open promenade, she felt the warmth of the late afternoon sun brush her face. The sea breeze tugged at her hair, filling her senses with the tang of salt. She breathed deeply, letting the wind carry away a fraction of her stress. As she leaned against the railing, her gaze drifted to the line of the horizon where sky and water met in a seamless wash of blues and golds. For a moment, her burdens felt lighter. The ocean had a way of reminding her of life's vast possibilities, even when she felt cornered. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. Turning, she saw him again, that tall, sun-kissed stranger who had helped Anselmo. He stood at the far end of the deck, seemingly lost in thought. His posture carried both confidence and a quiet reserve. Naomi wondered if he was just another passenger who happened to have a calm demeanor, or perhaps someone of greater importance than he let on. Before she could decide whether or not to approach, he glimpsed her and offered a small nod. Even from a distance, she sensed something pass between them, a flicker of recognition and an unspoken promise of more words to come. The moment spun out, charged with a tension she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her attention away. By the time she looked back, he was already moving out of sight. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her stomach as if to steady herself. There was something about him that she couldn't shake, a feeling that their paths were somehow aligned. Brushing stray hairs behind her ear, Naomi silently admitted that she was curious to know more. Yet she reminded herself she was here for work, not personal intrigue. She sighed, forcing her eyes back to the expanse of ocean rolling gently beneath the ship. Still, no matter how firmly she tried to root herself in logic, that subtle spark of fascination wouldn't leave. Her thoughts circled back to him, the tension in his gaze, the staff's reaction to him, the ease with which he had taken charge. There was a mystery there, and part of her wanted to solve it. Another part warned her not to get distracted. She couldn't afford complications. She couldn't afford anything that might jeopardize the job she so desperately needed. Yet the heart rarely obeys the mind in moments of curiosity and possibility. Even as she tried to keep her composure, she felt an undercurrent of excitement stirring. Perhaps there was more to this journey than she'd first imagined. The day's responsibilities still awaited her, and she eventually tore herself away from the railing. But as she descended toward the lower decks, she carried a new restlessness, a flutter of anticipation that refused to be quelled. Naomi forced herself to recall the older passengers who depended on her. That was priority one. Everything else came second. Deep down, though, she sensed something was about to change. She got back to her makeshift desk in the medical station, checked a few charts, and answered a call from the ship's main reception about a passenger requesting seasickness remedies. By the time evening approached, she felt exhausted and still anxious. The phone call with her sister weighed heavily on her, but she resolved to be strong. This job was a blessing, and she intended to do it well. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Naomi found herself on an outside deck once more, leaning against the railing with sore feet, but a mind unable to rest. She gazed out at the water, remembering Mrs. Martha's jokes and Anselmo's nearly disastrous climb on the staircase. The hum of the ship's engines soothed her, almost like a lullaby. Then her phone vibrated. She half expected it to be her sister again, but it was a general notification from a message board. She silenced it, not wanting any more distractions. In the slowly gathering dusk, she tried to brace herself for the days ahead. Long shifts, hidden challenges, the pressing need for money, and that strange tension she felt whenever she thought about the helpful stranger. Her thoughts spiraled through a haze of worry and cautious hope. Though she knew the next weeks could be exhausting, she also felt a quiet excitement flickering, as though she stood on the edge of a deeper story. The questions formed in her mind. Would she solve her sister's crisis in time? Who was that man, and why did he command such immediate respect? Was there a chance that the rumors were true, that he was the actual owner of the ship? She closed her eyes, letting the sea breeze wash over her once again. Far across the deck, a familiar figure passed silently, lingering in the corridor lights for a fleeting moment. Her pulse thudded. Even at a distance, she recognized the tilt of his head, the easy grace of his stride. He glanced back, meeting her gaze with an almost curious expression, then slipped away as someone beckoned him from the hall. Naomi's heart fluttered. Another intangible sign, a secret note in the melody of this journey, reminding her that something big might lie ahead. She tried to soothe herself with the recollection that she was only an employee. If he truly was who everyone whispered he might be, their worlds were too far apart. Yet the glimmer of possibility wouldn't be extinguished. She turned her attention again to the ocean, the wide sweep of darkening sky overhead, and let out a slow breath. She had so many responsibilities, so many questions, and no quick answers. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning. Suddenly her phone rang again. It was her sister. Naomi hesitated, remembering the shaky voice from earlier, but answered, prepared to comfort her in the only ways she could. After a brief conversation that ended with Naomi promising to send some payment as soon as possible, she hung up. The call left her uneasy, but determined. She tightened her grip on the railing, inhaling the brine-scented air, grounding herself in the moment. And then she saw him once more, far down the deck, his outline lit by a row of soft deck lamps. There was something in his posture, in the quiet intensity of his gaze that unsettled her. Yet it also hinted at a life-altering event lingering just out of reach. Naomi couldn't explain why, but she sensed that this tall, composed stranger would prove to be more than a mere passenger. Her heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. In that suspended fragment of time, Naomi understood her life was no longer the same as it had been when she first stepped aboard. Her path, once so narrowly fixed on the goal of helping her sister, was about to intersect with something unforeseen. She only hoped she was ready. At last, she turned away, the sea breeze ruffling her hair. Soft light glimmered off the water, and the low rumble of the engines lulled the scene into a gentle hush. Though she yearned for rest, her mind raced with an unspoken excitement. Change was in the air. She could feel it. She glanced over her shoulder, stealing one final look at him as he disappeared into the distance, and a curious warmth filled her chest. Then she left the deck to resume her duties, trying to swallow down the growing sense of fate swirling inside her. Naomi looks toward the horizon from the deck, still shaken by the call from her sister, and sees Alexander from afar. The way he looks at her brings forth a hunch. This encounter will change her life. Naomi woke earlier than usual the following morning, her mind still brimming with questions about the mysterious, soft-spoken man who had come to Anselmo's rescue. A sliver of sunlight peeked through the small porthole in her cabin, illuminating her cramped but tidy quarters. She blinked a few times, willing herself to shake off the last remnants of sleep. Yet even as she rose, her thoughts stayed firmly on the moments she'd shared with him on deck. She had spent the night torn between her duties, her growing curiosity, and the weight of her financial worries. After splashing water on her face and braiding her hair back, Naomi slipped into her uniform and headed toward the corridor. The ship was noticeably livelier now. Passengers bustled about, some in colorful resort wear and others still clad in pajamas, eagerly exploring all the decks had to offer. Over the intercom, a smooth voice announced a welcome reception to be held that evening, inviting everyone to join for cocktails, music, and a formal greeting from the ship's higher-ups. Naomi wondered if he would be there. Her first stop was the breakfast lounge, where a special table had been arranged for the group of elderly guests in her care. She spotted Mrs. Martha right away, wearing a bright floral blouse that reflected her sunny disposition. At her side sat Anselmo, the gentleman who'd nearly fainted climbing the deck stairs the day before. His usual jovial humor now seemed tempered by caution, and Naomi felt a twinge of sympathy, recalling how shaken he'd been. "Good morning, everyone," Naomi said, approaching the table with a gentle smile. "How did you sleep?" Marta offered her an energetic wave. "Oh, I always sleep like a log at sea. Must be the rocking of the ship. Anselmo here, however, got a scolding from me for overdoing it yesterday." "Rightfully so," Naomi teased, leaning down to check Anselmo's pulse in a quick, casual manner. He tolerated her fussing good-naturedly, lifting his sleeve to let her get a better read. "I'm feeling much better," he assured her, "though I promised not to go running up any stairs without someone by my side." His voice dropped to a playful whisper. "I don't want to miss any dancing after all." Naomi chuckled. "I'm glad you're feeling like yourself again, but please, take it slow." The buffet's aroma, a mixture of freshly brewed coffee, croissants, and sizzling bacon, made her stomach rumble. She gestured for them to eat while the food was still warm, then sank into a nearby chair. Quietly, she monitored each person around the table, noting subtle cues about their health or mood. She'd been hired to care for them, but the group almost felt like a circle of new friends. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Martha picked up on Naomi's distracted gaze. With a grandmotherly warmth, Marta patted Naomi's hand. "You seem distant, dear. Something on your mind?" Naomi hesitated, not wanting to burden them with her personal concerns. But Marta's gentle expression coaxed an answer out of her. "I'm a bit worried about my sister. She's behind on her college fees. I really want to help her." Marta nodded sympathetically. "That's a heavy responsibility. You'll manage. I can see it in you. There's real determination in those eyes." Anselmo chimed in with a grin. "You also seem a bit preoccupied with someone else." Heat rushed to Naomi's cheeks. She tried to brush it off. "Preoccupied? I don't know what you mean." Mrs. Martha snickered. "I may be old, my dear, but I'm not blind. You were rather taken with the gentleman who helped us yesterday. Don't think we all missed that." Naomi cleared her throat, focusing on her mug of tea. "I'm just grateful he was there. I have no clue who he is or if I'll even see him again." "Oh, you will," Marta replied with playful certainty. "I've got a nose for these things." Naomi didn't respond, though she felt her face grow warm. Soon, she excused herself to collect vital signs from another elderly passenger on the other side of the dining area. The teasing left her both amused and slightly uneasy. She had barely exchanged a few words with that man, yet the memory of his calm, confident presence wouldn't leave her alone. By mid-morning, Naomi had checked on all her assigned passengers. Most of them seemed energetic and eager for the evening's events. She paused in a corridor near the main lounge, reading a notice about the night's reception. The poster mentioned music, a short address from the ship's senior staff, and a chance for the passengers to mingle. Naomi's heart fluttered at the possibility that the intriguing stranger might be there, though she scolded herself for focusing too much on him. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Naomi, there you are." She turned to see one of the cruise staff approaching, a man named Raoul, who wore the crisp uniform of guest relations. "Hey, I've been looking for you. Some of us wanted to say thank you for stepping in so quickly when Anselmo nearly fainted." Naomi waved off the praise. "I was just doing my job." "But it helped keep everyone calm," Raoul insisted. "I heard that man who assisted you was also pretty impressive in how he handled the crowd." "Know who he is?" She shrugged, trying to sound casual. "No, I don't. Maybe just another passenger with a good heart." Raoul leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "All I've heard is rumors. Some say the owner of the ship is traveling incognito to see how things run when nobody knows he's around. If that's true, it could be him, or it could be someone else entirely. Hard to say, given the number of VIPs on board." Naomi's pulse quickened. "I guess we'll find out eventually," she said, forcing a polite smile before continuing on her way. She ran into the stranger far sooner than she expected, nearly colliding with him as she stepped around a corner outside the medical station. He looked fresh and relaxed, wearing casual attire that somehow still managed to look impeccable. She caught the faint scent of cologne, subtle yet disarmingly pleasant. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping back to regain her balance. He steadied her with a light touch to her forearm. "No harm done. Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She cleared her throat. "I was on my way to restock a few medical supplies." He nodded, his eyes steady on hers for a moment. "Good. I just wanted to check on your patient, Anselmo. Is he feeling better today?" She smiled, touched by his concern. "Much better, thanks. In fact, he's back to teasing everyone about how he plans to dance tonight." "That's great to hear. Thank you for taking care of him." Naomi hesitated, unsure if this was her chance to ask more personal questions. At the same time, she didn't want to sound pushy. "I'm glad you were there to help too." He offered a modest shrug. "I did what anyone else would do in that situation." Not everyone has such a calm head when faced with an emergency. For a moment he just watched her, his gaze intent but friendly. "I suppose. Anyway," he said, glancing over his shoulder, "I won't keep you from your work." She wanted to call after him, maybe ask if he'd be at the reception that night, but her voice caught in her throat. Before she could gather the courage, he gave a polite nod and slipped away into the lively crowd passing through the corridor. The rest of the day went by in a blur of activities. Naomi accompanied her elderly group as they strolled along the deck, took photos beside the rails, and played cards in the lounge. Every now and then, she'd spot that golden brown head of hair at the edge of her vision, or catch a glimpse of his tall frame among other guests. Yet each time, before she could approach, he disappeared, swallowed up by the shifting streams of people. As evening arrived, the excitement among the passengers became contagious. People dressed in their nicest outfits for the welcome reception. While this wasn't a strictly black-tie event, Naomi noticed several guests opting for elegant dresses or sharp suits. She herself wore a simple dark skirt and a blouse she hoped looked formal enough. A pang of insecurity washed over her. She didn't own a vast wardrobe and every piece had to be practical. Still, it would have to do. Inside the ship's main ballroom, soft music played. Rows of chairs ringed a polished dance floor. At the far end of the room, waiters circled with trays of champagne and sparkling juice. Colored lights swept the space, reflecting off chandeliers, and the murmurs of conversation grew louder as more guests filed in. Naomi stayed close to her group of seniors, making sure they felt comfortable. Mrs. Martha, wearing a delicate shawl around her shoulders, beamed at the surroundings. Anselmo walked with careful steps, tapping his cane on the floor in time to the music, evidently determined to claim at least one dance. Suddenly, the band struck up a livelier tune, and some of the braver passengers ventured onto the dance floor. Encouraged by the mood, Anselmo tugged Naomi's arm. "Nurse or not, you're at a party. Come dance with me for a moment, just until I can catch my breath." She laughed. "All right, but you let me know if you feel the slightest bit dizzy." They ambled onto the floor, and though Anselmo's steps were slow, his grin was wide. Naomi moved carefully in time with the music, helping him keep his balance. A handful of onlookers cheered for them, touched by the sight of a young nurse dancing with her older charge. Moments like these reminded Naomi why she loved her profession, the chance to bring small joys to those who needed them most. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a flash of movement near the edge of the crowd. The man from before, he was there, leaning casually against a pillar, observing the scene. Caught off guard by the weight of his gaze, Naomi felt her cheeks warm. She tried to focus on Anselmo, but her eyes drifted back to the stranger every few seconds. Anselmo must have sensed her distraction because he followed her line of sight and gave a knowing chuckle. "He's watching you. Why don't you two dance?" She blushed, shaking her head. "I'm here to take care of you, not to—" Before she could finish, the music's volume spiked. A sudden wave of applause rippled through the crowd, and the swirl of bodies on the dance floor expanded, forcing Naomi and Anselmo to step aside. That was when someone from the group, another elderly woman named Clarice, staggered, pressing a hand to her chest. Naomi's medical instincts kicked in. She excused herself from Anselmo's grasp and hurried toward Clarice, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Clarice was breathing heavily. "Dizzy," she managed. "Might have stood up too fast. Naomi guided her to a nearby chair and signaled for water. Tension spread among the onlookers, hushed conversations buzzing with concern. In less than a minute, the entire mood of the evening threatened to darken. Suddenly, the man Naomi had been watching appeared, parting the anxious onlookers with calm efficiency. He bent toward Clarice, placing a hand on her wrist as though checking her pulse. Immediately, Naomi recognized the same quiet confidence she'd witnessed the day before with Anselmo. "Let's give her some space," he said in a low voice, prompting the nearby crowd to step back. "Are you her nurse?" he asked, glancing at Naomi. She nodded, already retrieving her portable kit from her small bag. "Yes, thank you for helping. Clarice, focus on breathing slowly." Together, they made sure Clarice's breathing steadied. The staff brought a glass of water, which Naomi helped her sip. Gradually, the woman's complexion regained color, and she managed a weak smile. "I'm sorry for causing a scene," Clarice murmured. Naomi shook her head gently. "Not at all. We just want you to be all right." A soft murmur passed through the gathering crowd. Relief. Sensing the crisis had passed, the strangers drifting at the edges began to disperse, letting the music fill in the silence again. Naomi and her companion remained by Clarice's side, reassuring her. When Clarice felt stable enough to walk, Naomi offered her arm, guiding her to a quieter spot with comfortable seating. The man stood close, making sure no one jostled them. Naomi couldn't help noticing how easily he commanded the situation, and how other staff members nodded respectfully in his presence, almost like they were used to following his lead. Once Clarice was settled, Naomi rose, exhaling slowly. "She just overdid it. I'll check on her in a bit, but for now she should rest." "That's good thinking," he said, meeting her gaze. "You handle emergencies well." "Thank you. I appreciate your help again." A small smile touched his lips, but he didn't linger. As though sensing Naomi needed to ensure Clarice's comfort, he gave a slight bow of his head and slipped back into the mingling guests. Naomi watched him go, her heart pounding from the mix of adrenaline and curiosity. She sank onto a chair beside Clarice and patted the woman's hand reassuringly. Mrs. Martha and Anselmo hurried over to check on them both, their faces etched with worry. Naomi gave them a gentle nod, signaling that Clarice was fine now. Clarice's breathing was much calmer, and though she still looked pale, the worst had passed. "You're a true angel, dear," she said, offering Naomi a grateful smile. Naomi felt a surge of relief. "I'm just glad I was close by." She glanced around, searching for the man who had helped, but he'd vanished among the dancers, staff, and music. Just like before, he was there one moment and gone the next. With Clarice now stable, Naomi set about picking up the scattered supplies from her first aid kit. That was when Mrs. Martha leaned in, her voice hushed. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "I think I've seen that young man's face somewhere before. Somewhere very important." Naomi paused in the act of gathering a roll of bandages, her heart giving a jolt. "Really?" Marta nodded, lips pursing as though piecing together a memory. "Yes. I can't recall precisely, but I'm almost certain." She glanced across the room, where the faint figure of that tall stranger disappeared through a door. "Mark my words, there's more to him than meets the eye." Naomi lifted her gaze, watching his silhouette vanish. A tremor of intrigue coursed through her. She had no idea how deeply this discovery would reshape her path, but an undeniable sense of anticipation already pressed against her chest. While Naomi gathers her first aid supplies, an elderly passenger whispers that they recognize Alexander from somewhere very important, and Naomi glances up at him, intrigued, never suspecting how much more she would soon discover about this mysterious man. Naomi woke up the following day with a restlessness she couldn't quite name. The soft glow of morning light seeped into her cabin, reminding her she was miles from home, surrounded by endless water. Though her bedside clock showed it was still early, she knew there'd be no more sleep. Her mind buzzed with questions about Alexander, if that was indeed the name of the man who'd so frequently crossed her path, and the strange whispers from the elderly passengers who claimed they recognized him from somewhere important. She tidied her small cabin before setting out for the day. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant, and nearby she heard muffled footsteps as crew members hurried to start their routines. Naomi's first task was to check on Clarice, who had nearly collapsed at the welcome party the night before. Finding the older woman in her cabin, Naomi was relieved to see her rested and in improved spirits. "Good morning, dear," Clarice greeted with a soft laugh. "I'm sorry about the scare I gave everyone." "You gave us all a fright," Naomi said gently, taking a seat on the edge of the bed to check Clarice's pulse. "How are you feeling?" "A bit tired," the woman admitted, "but not dizzy anymore. The party was lovely, but it seems my body wasn't quite up for so much excitement." Naomi made a note to follow up later in the day. "You take it easy. If you feel anything unusual, call me straight away, all right?" Clarice patted Naomi's hand. "You're too kind, dear. Thank you for looking out for us." She left Clarice's cabin feeling lighter. One crisis down, at least for the moment. But her thoughts soon drifted elsewhere. She remembered Alexander's purposeful way of dispersing onlookers the night before. His help had been timely once again. There was something about the man that felt significant, beyond a casual passenger's concern. Later, while strolling the deck, Naomi spotted her reflection in a glass wall. The lines of worry at the edges of her eyes betrayed how anxious she was beneath her professional facade. The phone call from her sister the previous night still echoed in her ears. More late fees, more financial threats. She shook her head, forcing a small breath of calm. No matter the undercurrent of tension, she had to focus on the present. Right now, she was just an onboard nurse doing her best. Around mid-morning, she found an empty bench beneath a shaded awning on the promenade deck. The wind carried the salty scent of the sea, and she closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. For a moment she listened to the rhythmic whoosh of the waves against the ship's hull. Then she pulled out her phone, intending to check any messages. The weak signal frustrated her, but she tapped away, hoping for a scrap of news about her sister's tuition or an encouraging note from home. Just then, A distinct voice spoke behind her. "Any luck with the signal here?" She jumped slightly, turning to see Alexander standing a few steps away, hands in his pockets. The morning light brought out the subtle gold streaks in his hair, and he seemed almost casual, a stark contrast to the commanding presence she had witnessed the evening before. "It's pretty spotty," she admitted, trying not to let her heart hammer too noticeably. "I was hoping to hear from my sister." He nodded, taking a few steps forward. When he settled near her, the bench felt suddenly too small, the air too charged. "I apologize if I startled you," he said. "I saw you sitting here and thought I'd say hello." She offered a small, polite smile. "No apology needed. I was just lost in my own world." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you again for helping with Clarice last night. She's doing much better this morning." "That's good to hear." He paused for a heartbeat. "Did you enjoy the rest of the reception?" Naomi shrugged. "I didn't stay much longer after that. I had to make sure Clarice was all right, and by the time everything settled, the party was wrapping up." Alexander's features flickered with a hint of concern. "I hope you still find some time to enjoy yourself on this cruise. You're working so hard." She let out a small laugh, a mix of amusement and stress. "I'm just grateful for the job. Fun isn't exactly my priority right now." His gaze held steady on her, as though weighing something unsaid. Before either could continue, the ring of his phone cut through the hush of the deck. Alexander tensed, glanced at the screen, and excused himself, stepping away to answer it. Though she couldn't discern the full conversation, she heard the low, clipped tone of frustration in his voice. Then, in a swirl of abrupt energy, he was gone, disappearing down a corridor with the phone pressed to his ear, leaving Naomi perplexed and curious. She wandered to the lower decks after lunch, checking on her elderly group. They were abuzz about the evening's masquerade party. Evidently, the cruise organizers had scheduled a masked ball in the main ballroom, a luxurious event where passengers could dress up, sip cocktails, and dance under colored lights. Naomi was invited but uncertain she'd attend. Large crowds made her anxious, especially when her responsibilities included ensuring the well-being of vulnerable guests. Yet Mrs. Martha and Anselmo were unusually persuasive. "That sounds like a perfect opportunity for you to have fun," Marta said, leaning forward in her seat to emphasize her point. "And anyway, we'll all be there, safe under your watchful eye." Anselmo grinned conspiratorially. "If that tall gentleman shows up, maybe you'll get your chance to dance with him." Naomi groaned in mock exasperation, though she felt heat creeping into her cheeks. "You two have very active imaginations." They only laughed, clearly enjoying her embarrassment. Nevertheless, their gentle prodding convinced her to go. She needed to maintain a presence at the party for her group's sake, if nothing else. That night, she donned a simple black dress, one she had tucked away for special occasions. The small mirror in her cabin reflected an image she barely recognized. With the addition of a modest masquerade mask, she felt oddly transformed, like someone stepping into a role that wasn't entirely hers. Soft, haunting music drifted through the corridors as she made her way to the ballroom. The decorations were extravagant, vibrant drapes of rich reds and golds, flickering candlelight from electric sconces, and swirling lights that spun across the floor. Guests in elaborate masks and elegant attire filled the space. Naomi spotted Mrs. Martha wearing a playful pink mask adorned with feathers. Anselmo's mask was dark green, but she could recognize his cane and the slight limp in his step anywhere. Glancing around, she felt a pang of nerves. She had no idea if Alexander would appear. She tried to tamp down her curiosity, focusing instead on ensuring her elderly friends were comfortable. Yet each time the doors opened to admit new arrivals, her eyes darted in that direction. Eventually, he did arrive. She spotted him the moment he entered. His mask was a simple black half-mask, but it did nothing to hide the confident tilt of his chin or the intensity of his gaze. Her heart lurched. He surveyed the ballroom for a moment before stepping inside fully, weaving through dancing couples and bowing politely to greet some of the other passengers. Despite the swirl of color and motion, Naomi felt drawn to him like a magnet. For a time, the party carried on without incident. The band played lively music, and costumed pairs spun across the floor. Naomi allowed herself a single flute of sparkling juice, just enough to enjoy the festive spirit. Standing near the edge of the dance floor, she kept an eye on Anselmo and Marta, though they were more than capable of enjoying themselves. Occasionally, one or two elderly passengers would rest in chairs, sipping water or fanning themselves, perfectly content. Then, as the tempo changed to something slower, a hint of trouble brewed. A rather tall, disheveled man stumbled across the floor, nearly colliding with Anselmo. Naomi's eyes narrowed when she realized the man was clearly intoxicated. He mumbled something under his breath, weaving perilously in front of the older guests. Onlookers shifted uneasily. In a matter of seconds, a confrontation erupted. The drunk man began to spout insults at anyone in his path, his words incoherent but loud. Naomi stepped forward, intent on guiding Anselmo out of the way. She placed a calm hand on the man's shoulder, trying to lead him away peacefully. But his swaying figure resisted, turning toward her with a sneer. "Don't you touch me," he slurred, a bit of spittle shining at the corner of his mouth. "Think you're better than me, huh?" Naomi's heart pounded. "No one's trying to judge you. Let's move this way, sir. You're upsetting some of the—" "Get off!" he snarled. His drunken hand flailed toward her arm. Before Naomi could react, Alexander was there, slipping between them with practiced ease. In one swift motion, he caught the man's wrist to prevent him from striking Naomi. The bright lights of the ballroom cast sharp reflections off the gold trim on Alexander's cufflinks. "That's enough," Alexander said quietly. His voice was even but resolute. "You're disturbing the other guests. What's it to you?" The drunk tried to push forward but found himself effectively blocked by Alexander's calm strength. Furious and unsteady, the man spat curses. Naomi swallowed, stepping back to give Alexander room. Within moments, a pair of security staff arrived. Alexander motioned for them to escort the disruptive man away. The commotion drew stares from nearby dancers, who paused to watch the scene unfold. A hush fell over the immediate circle of partygoers as they took in Alexander's confident stance and the decisive way he dealt with the situation. When the security team led the drunk man out, Naomi exhaled a shaky breath, her pulse still hammered from the sudden confrontation. She looked up at Alexander, unsure whether to thank him or ask if he was okay. The crowd around them began to disperse now that order had been restored, though many cast lingering, curious glances in Alexander's direction. "That was intense," Naomi managed to say at last. He turned to her, the faint outline of a reassuring smile on his lips. "Are you all right?" She nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, thanks to you." Before he could respond, a new wave of music struck up, lively and joyful, as though attempting to erase the tension. Alexander offered Naomi a hand. "This might sound strange given the circumstances, but would you like to step away from here for a moment? Perhaps get some fresh air?" She hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." They wove through the masked crowd until they reached the ornate doors that led to an outdoor deck. Once outside, the night air felt instantly soothing against Naomi's skin. Stars sparkled above, their reflections dancing on the dark ocean surface. Alexander leaned against the railing, inhaling deeply. "I'm sorry you had to see that altercation," he said, his tone gentle. "Some people can't handle their liquor." Naomi joined him, arms resting on the railing. "No need to apologize. You intervened just in time. Thank you." Silence stretched between them, filled by the distant rush of water. Naomi's mind spun with fresh questions. Who was this man who not only knew how to handle emergencies but also seemed intimately familiar with the ship's staff? And why did he keep vanishing whenever she tried to learn more? As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander shifted, turning to face her more fully. The soft overhead lights on the deck caught the edges of his mask, highlighting his eyes. He began, then paused, struggling to find the right words. Just as Naomi opened her mouth to ask him a burning question, the door to the deck burst open, and a staff member hurried out. "Sir, I'm so sorry to interrupt," the crew member said breathlessly. "We need you inside. There's an urgent matter that requires your attention." Alexander's expression tightened in frustration. He glanced at Naomi with an apologetic look, a storm of conflicting emotions in his eyes. She felt a pang of disappointment. Once again, their conversation was cut short before he could reveal anything about himself. He bowed his head slightly. "I have to go. Will you be all right here?" Naomi forced a faint smile and nodded. "Yes, I'll be fine. Go ahead." He lingered for a heartbeat, as though torn between leaving and staying. Then he squared his shoulders and slipped back through the doors. Naomi remained at the railing, heart full of unspoken questions. The night air pressed in, laden with possibilities she couldn't fully grasp. She breathed out slowly, staring at the moonlit waves beyond the ship. Somewhere behind her, the music continued, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Yet she couldn't help feeling that something huge was on the verge of unfolding, and she was in the middle of it without quite knowing why. Alexander's name whispered through her thoughts. She wondered if, before the cruise ended, she'd learned the truth of who he really was. Just then, the door to the deck opened once more. Naomi turned, half expecting to see the staff member again, but it was only a couple seeking a quiet place to talk. Realizing she needed to check on her elderly group, she stepped back inside, her mind still swirling with unanswered questions. Alexander walks in Naomi's direction, seeming ready to share something important, but before he can speak, a staff member urgently calls for him. He says goodbye to Naomi with an intense look, promising they need to talk later. Naomi had barely slept. She woke that morning with a fluttery sensation of excitement that left her unsure whether to be thrilled or apprehensive. Memories of Alexander's gaze, the quiet authority in his voice, and the momentary closeness they had shared on the deck before he was called away, all chased one another through her mind. She tried to tell herself to stay focused on work. She was here as a nurse, after all, and she couldn't afford any distractions, but the thought of him never fully disappeared. Soon she was out of her cabin, starting her usual rounds. She moved through the corridors where bright, tasteful artwork adorned the walls, politely greeting passengers who passed by. Some recognized her from the previous night's incidents and smiled or nodded in thanks. Others seemed more preoccupied with booking excursions or sampling the day's buffet. Naomi appreciated the routine. It allowed her to maintain a sense of normalcy, even though beneath it all she felt a quickened pulse whenever her mind drifted to Alexander. During one of her checks, she noticed a slight commotion at the far end of the ship, where a cluster of passengers was fanning themselves in front of an elevator bank. When she approached, a member of the cleaning crew mentioned that the air conditioning had momentarily gone down on that deck. A minor inconvenience, but these little glitches reminded Naomi of how even a seemingly perfect luxury cruise could encounter unexpected hiccups. After making sure the few elderly folks in her care were comfortable and hydrated, she ducked into a staff pantry to grab some water for herself. The small utilitarian room was a sharp contrast to the lavish areas reserved for guests. She was swallowing the last sip from her cup when, out of nowhere, a calm, familiar voice spoke from behind. "You really do work around the clock." Spinning around, she found Alexander leaning in the doorway, his posture relaxed. Today, he wore casual clothing, pressed trousers and a fitted polo shirt that somehow still exuded quiet elegance. Naomi felt her cheeks warm unexpectedly. "I can't say the same for you," she replied, trying for a light tone. "You're everywhere and nowhere at once. It's like you have 1,000 responsibilities." He gave her a slightly rueful smile. It feels that way sometimes. A few silent seconds passed. Naomi's heartbeat thrummed in her ears, but she forced herself to remain steady. "How can I help you?" she managed. He took a step inside, letting the pantry door close gently behind him. "Actually, I came looking for you. I wanted to check if you'd had any trouble after the drama at last night's party." Her mind flicked back to the drunken passenger and how quickly Alexander had neutralized the conflict. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Thank you for intervening again." He nodded, relief sparking in his eyes. "You have a knack for handling emergencies, but you shouldn't have to deal with that alone." Naomi found herself studying his face. His expression carried a hint of concern, maybe even regret. Before she could follow that line of thought, the ship's public address system clicked on, requesting her to attend to a passenger who felt faint in one of the lounges. She bit her lip, torn between wanting to continue speaking with him and needing to answer the call of duty. "Go," he said, reading her hesitation. "We can talk later." She nodded and rushed out, feeling his gaze on her until she turned the corner. In the late afternoon, Naomi found herself guiding Mrs. Martha and a few others around the sun deck. With the weather holding fair, many passengers lounged by the pool, sipping brightly colored drinks. The ocean spread around them in endless, shimmering blue. Naomi tried to savor the breeze, letting it calm her thoughts. Yet every few minutes, she'd catch herself scanning the crowd for Alexander, half expecting him to appear again. A short time later, she heard shouts from the far side of the deck. A small group of passengers peered over the rail, pointing at something in the water. When Naomi hurried over, she realized it was nothing serious, just excitement at a distant pod of dolphins gliding alongside the ship. The tension in her chest loosened. This was a moment of pure delight. The elderly ladies giggled with the excitement of children, while Naomi felt a rush of gratitude that the day's only surprises had been pleasant so far. But that peaceful moment wouldn't last. An hour later, a ripple of concern swept through the corridors. The ship's internal communication system briefly shut down, leaving certain zones without announcements or staff contact. Naomi picked up on the worry in the staff's voices. Rumor had it there was a mechanical glitch in the electrical system. Nothing life-threatening, but the kind of issue that could cause chaos if not resolved quickly. Naomi gathered her supplies and made ready to move to a safe staging area, just in case. Her duties required that she ensure the well-being of the older passengers, especially those with mobility or health concerns. She stayed near her group, soothing their fears. The lights flickered once or twice, but the backup generators kicked in, preventing a total blackout. Still, it was enough to keep everyone on edge. She led Mrs. Martha, Clarice, and Anselmo to a quieter part of the ship, an auxiliary lounge that had large windows overlooking the ocean. "Let's wait here," she suggested. "The staff will keep us updated, and we'll stay away from any crowded staircases or elevators until everything's sorted out." It was while she was reassuring them that Alexander appeared again, this time with a purposeful stride and a tension around his eyes. He paused upon seeing Naomi and her charges, then approached calmly. She noticed the other staff members discreetly stepping aside, as though deferring to him. A flicker of certainty hit Naomi. He had more authority than he let on, much more. "How are you all holding up?" he asked, voice polite but laced with concern. Anselmo grumbled good-naturedly about the flickering lights. "It's like the poltergeist is after us," he joked. But Naomi could tell the older man wasn't too shaken. Mrs. Martha simply smiled at Alexander. "I'm sure you'll sort everything out," she said, her tone strangely confident. Alexander met her gaze. "We will," he replied, an undercurrent in his voice that made Naomi wonder just how deeply involved he was in the ship's operations. He glanced at Naomi. "I might need your help in a moment if you're free." She blinked, thrown off balance. "My help? With what?" "Some of the crew have been redirected to different tasks because of this system glitch. There's an area near the lower maintenance corridor where a few passengers have become anxious. You have a reassuring presence." Though uncertain, she nodded. "All right. Just let me make sure my group is comfortable." Leaving Mrs. Martha, Clarice, and Anselmo with a couple of attendants, Naomi followed Alexander down a staff staircase. The air grew cooler, and the hum of machinery was more pronounced this far below deck. They passed a few crew members who were checking wiring panels. Naomi tried to keep her nerves in check. This wasn't an area typically open to guests, and the maze of corridors left her slightly disoriented. At last, they reached a small hallway where two frightened passengers huddled, evidently lost. They jumped at the sight of Alexander and Naomi, looking relieved. "Oh, thank goodness," one of them exclaimed. "We've been trying to find our way back to our cabin, but the signs are so confusing here." Naomi stepped forward, her voice gentle. "It's all right. The lights have been flickering and the signs might be harder to read, but we'll guide you back. Do you feel dizzy? Need any medical attention?" They both shook their heads. One admitted she was just claustrophobic. Alexander reassured them that they were safe and asked Naomi to walk them to a service elevator that would bypass the busier decks. She gladly took the lead, noticing how the presence of the tall, composed man seemed to ease the passengers' jitters as well. By the time Naomi got them safely onto the elevator and waved them off, her heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of navigating those corridors. She turned to see Alexander standing quietly behind her, tension etched on his brow. "Thank you," he said simply. She let out a breath. "I didn't do much, just walked them along." He tilted his head in faint disagreement. "You have a gift for making people feel calm. That matters more than you realize." The intensity in his words made her breath hitch. She was about to respond when an alarm blared down the hallway, not loud enough to signal a critical emergency, but sharp enough to warn of some ongoing issue. Over the speakers, a tinny voice requested specific personnel to check the main generator area. Alexander's eyes flickered with concern. "I have to look into that," he murmured. Naomi watched him for a beat, her suspicions growing. "What exactly is your role on this ship?" she asked, her tone soft but direct. For a moment, he opened his mouth as though on the verge of telling her everything. His gaze burned into hers, revealing a depth of emotion, maybe even a desire to confide. But the alarm persisted, echoing around them in rhythmic pulses. At last, he sighed. "I promise I'll explain," he said, voice low. "Tonight, come to the upper deck after dinner. I'll be waiting for you." She could only nod, her stomach twisting with anticipation. With that, Alexander rushed off toward the source of the alarm. Naomi stood in the corridor, feeling the cool metal walls pressing in. The ship's hum felt louder than ever, or perhaps her senses were just on high alert. She realized this man had the power to change everything in her life, for better or for worse. Evening found her on the upper deck fighting off nerves. The ocean breeze had kicked up, scattering her hair around her face. She tucked loose strands behind her ears, scanning the horizon for any sign of him. The watery expanse glistened under the moon's pale glow, but for a long while she saw no movement. Then, faintly, she heard footsteps. Turning, she found Alexander approaching, his expression serious yet flooded with relief, as though he'd been longing for this moment. They walked side by side along the railing, the hush of the water beneath them. He spoke in measured tones, explaining that the electrical mishap was under control and that no passenger was in serious danger. Still, some of the older guests were anxious, so more staff had been deployed to reassure them. Naomi nodded, only half listening. The urgency of the day's crisis had given way to an entirely different kind of tension. She realized her pulse was thumping with the heavy knowledge that the man beside her might hold a secret that changed how she saw everything. They reached a secluded corner near the bow, where the ship's lights grew dimmer. Moonlight glowed on the metal rails, and the wind carried the salty tang of the open sea. Naomi's heart hammered. Alexander turned to face her fully. "I haven't been entirely truthful," he began, voice low. "Not because I wanted to deceive you. I needed to be sure of your kindness. your authenticity." She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. Before she could respond, a sudden jolt coursed through the ship, not enough to topple them, but enough to send a tremor up through the deck. Naomi instinctively grabbed the railing. "What was that?" she asked, alarm creeping into her voice. Alexander lifted his head as if listening for any announcement. None came. Seconds later, a crackle on the ship's speakers indicated some static, then silence. He exhaled sharply. "It must be related to the repairs. Let's not panic." But adrenaline sparked in both of them. Naomi felt her chest tighten. This day had been relentless, one challenge after another. They stepped away from the railing as the overhead lights flickered ominously. Footsteps pounded on a distant stairway, and she guessed more crew were racing to investigate whatever had caused the jolt. Alexander caught her gaze. "We might need to go see if anyone needs help." Naomi nodded, her thoughts spinning. She prayed that no one was hurt and that the day's troubles would finally end. They hurried toward a door leading indoors, only to find it locked from the inside, likely a safety measure triggered during the glitch. A swirl of panic threatened Naomi, but she reminded herself to stay calm. "We can cut around through the other side," she offered, leading him toward a set of exterior stairs. As they reached the landing, the overhead light flickered, then steadied. He placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her carefully. They managed to circle around to a rear entrance and slip inside. The corridor was empty, but the echo of distant voices told them many people were in the main atrium or the staff areas, dealing with whatever malfunction had shaken the ship. At last, they found an isolated hallway where the lights held steady. She leaned against the wall, breathing hard. He ran a hand through his hair, looking equally shaken. Then, their eyes locked with an intensity that made the entire rest of the world seem to dissolve. The closeness, the brushed nerves, the swirl of relief at finding no immediate danger. It all converged into a spark of raw electricity. He spoke quietly. "Naomi?" She didn't wait for him to finish. Whether it was the lingering fear of the mechanical issues or the emotional roller coaster of the entire day, she surged forward, closing the gap between them. Their lips met in a rush of pent-up need. For a moment, she forgot they were on a ship, forgot the flickering lights and the pressing concerns. Her mind swam in a haze of warmth, of his heartbeat against hers. He slipped an arm around her waist, and she let her worries fade to static. The hallway's hush enveloped them, the tension of the day transmuting into a tender urgency. At last, they broke apart, breathless. She opened her eyes to find his face only inches away, concern and desire swirling together. He parted his lips to speak, but a staff member's distant shout wrenched them back to reality. "We should get you to your cabin," he said softly. "It's safer there until we're certain everything is stable." She nodded, her head spinning. In silence, they made their way through a series of passages. When they reached the door to her cabin, he lingered, one hand resting lightly on her arm. "I promise," he murmured. "I'll tell you everything. It's just, my responsibilities call me away again." For a split second, Naomi's frustration simmered, but she saw the conflict in his expression, the regret and the urgency. Carefully, she pulled her keycard from her pocket, swiped it, and stepped inside. He hovered in the doorway, seeming poised to say more. Yet a crackle on his phone, a summons from some unseen authority, drew his attention. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but her voice refused to form the words. The jarring alarm from earlier still echoed in her mind, reminding her that the day's troubles might not be over. So she simply squeezed his hand in quiet acceptance, and he gave a wordless nod. A moment later, he was gone, footsteps echoing down the corridor. Naomi let out a shaky breath and closed the door. The abrupt silence rushed at her like a tidal wave. She pressed a hand to her chest, hardly able to steady her breathing. Whatever this was, this connection, this chemistry, it was more than just a passing intrigue. Something had shifted between them, and she felt it in every beat of her racing heart. The overhead light flickered once, casting wavering shadows against the cabin walls, but remained lit. Naomi sank onto the edge of her narrow bed, trying to calm her thoughts. Her mind soared with questions. Why was Alexander called away again and again? What exactly was his role on this ship? And why did she feel so certain her life was never going to be the same? She ran her palms over her face, recalling the soft pressure of his lips, the warmth of his embrace. Her heart fluttered at the memory, but her stomach clenched with the weight of all the unknowns. With her heart pounding, Naomi closed the door of her cabin, feeling that something profound had changed in their relationship. Naomi had barely left her cabin that morning when she noticed something different in the way people moved about the corridors. Even the hum of the ship's engines seemed charged with an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite define. She paused near a wide window that overlooked the ocean, trying to compose herself. The memory of the previous evening lingered in her thoughts. Her and Alexander's near-intimate conversation on the deck, cut short by yet another call for his attention, followed by that unexpected heated kiss in a deserted hallway. Her cheeks warmed at the thought of it. Once she felt more grounded, Naomi started her rounds. Anselmo, Clarice, and Mrs. Martha awaited their usual medical check-ins, though in truth she'd grown almost as much a friend to them as a nurse. They asked for updates on the ship's glitches, especially after the mechanical issues and sudden jolts that had rattled everyone's nerves. "It's a big ship," Naomi answered, keeping her tone reassuring, "and big ships sometimes have technical hiccups. But as far as I know, everything is under control." She poured Anselmo a cup of water and offered him a warm smile. "Anyway, no news is good news, right?" Anselmo eyed her slyly. "Is that how you feel about your mysterious friend too? No news is good news?" Naomi felt heat spread across her face. She glanced at Mrs. Martha, who was discreetly observing her reaction. Ever since the group had spotted the chemistry between her and Alexander, they seemed determined to tease her about it every chance they got. She gave a cautious shrug. "He's busy, I suppose." That was all she said before changing the subject, hoping they wouldn't pry. But she could tell they were far from fooled. Deep down, Naomi admitted she was curious to see Alexander again. He had promised he'd tell her the truth about his role on the ship, yet every time they got close, a new problem surfaced that demanded his attention. She couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that he wasn't just another passenger. People deferred to him, staff members took cues from him, and the rumors around the ship pointed to someone powerful traveling incognito. By early afternoon, Naomi's obligations led her toward the upper decks, where many guests were sunbathing and enjoying ocean views. The day was bright and breezy, with gulls coasting in the ship's wake. She found it both peaceful and slightly surreal. How could everything appear so tranquil after the near chaos of the previous day? She just stepped onto the outdoor promenade when she spotted Alexander in conversation with a uniformed officer near the railing. The officer stood at attention, nodding fervently as if receiving instructions. Alexander dismissed him with a courteous gesture, then turned and noticed Naomi. For a fleeting moment, neither moved. The ocean wind ruffled his hair, and his gaze locked with hers. She saw relief in his eyes, perhaps even a touch of longing. "Naomi," he said, coming closer, "I was hoping to find you." She forced a casual smile. "Busy day?" His lips curved wryly. "They all seem busy lately." He paused, glancing around to ensure no one hovered within earshot. "Listen, about last night." Her cheeks warmed. The memory of their kiss flashed in her mind. "We don't have to talk about it now if you're—" "I want to," he cut in gently. "I want to explain everything. I'll be free for a while this evening once we leave port. I'd like to have dinner with you, somewhere quieter, away from the crowds." Naomi's pulse fluttered. She thought of how any time he tried to explain himself, something intervened. Still, she felt compelled by the sincerity in his voice. "Okay," she agreed softly. "I'll meet you. Just tell me when and where." His relief was palpable. "I'll send someone with details later," he promised. Then, as if compelled by an unspoken urge, he reached out and gently brushed his fingertips along her arm. The contact was brief, but it sent a wave of warmth through her. He left soon after, called away yet again by an urgent message on his phone. Naomi stood alone, the steady breeze teasing strands of her hair. She stared after him, questions swirling in her mind. Who exactly was he? And why did she feel so certain she could trust him? That evening she found a note slipped under her cabin door, a simple invitation with a location and time. Her heart thudded at the neat handwriting. Determined not to overthink it, she changed into a modest but elegant dress she'd brought along, deep blue with a flowy skirt that moved gently around her legs. She kept her hair simple, pinned back on one side. A slight nervousness fluttered in her stomach, but she steadied herself. She was here to finally learn the truth after all. Following the note's directions, Naomi traversed a corridor seldom used by passengers, eventually arriving at a small private dining room she hadn't known existed. Soft yellow light emanated from wall sconces, and a large window revealed the endless night sky and dark waves rolling beyond. A single table sat in the center, laid with crisp linens, a candle, and 2 place settings. The entire space felt worlds away from the bustle of the main dining halls. Alexander was already there, dressed in a tailored shirt that accentuated his lean build. He stood as she approached, offering a subdued, grateful smile. For a moment, they said nothing. Then he gestured for her to sit, and they eased into chairs across from one another. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted quietly, pouring them both a glass of sparkling water. "I wasn't sure if you'd have to dash off again," she answered with a light laugh. He exhaled, looking faintly embarrassed. "I can't blame you for thinking that." A steward soon appeared, serving small plates of delicately arranged appetizers, seafood, fresh greens, and savory sauces. The hush of the room was almost overwhelming, broken only by the clink of cutlery and the gentle rocking of the ship. Alexander thanked the steward, then waited until they were alone again before he spoke. "I want to start by apologizing," he began. "I haven't been fair to you, asking for your trust, and then running off without explaining why." Naomi dipped her head in acknowledgement. "You've certainly been mysterious, but I sense you have your reasons." He looked out the window for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. "I'm Alexander Whitfield," he said at last, voice calm but loaded with meaning. "My family founded Whitfield Cruises decades ago. I'm not just a guest here. This entire ship, this entire line, really. My father built it up, and I'm expected to continue his legacy." Her heart pounded. Hearing him say it out loud felt surreal, even though she'd half-guessed the truth. "So you really are the owner?" He nodded, searching her face for signs of shock or disappointment. "I've been traveling incognito to see how the staff and passengers are treated when there's no obvious boss watching over them. I want to understand the business from the ground up, not just in corporate offices, but I also never anticipated meeting someone like you, someone so genuine, someone who sees people for who they are, not for their name or wealth." Naomi's mind whirled. For a moment she had no idea what to say. She recalled every time he'd vanished to handle a crisis, every staff member who seemed to revere him. It all fell into place now. "I suppose that explains a lot," she said softly. "And you thought I might treat you differently if I knew?" "Yes," he admitted, "and many do. They see me as a bank account, or an opportunity for personal gain. I'm sorry if it feels like I deceived you. I just—" He trailed off, his eyes flickering with vulnerability. Naomi reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "I understand. You might have chosen a better approach, but I get it. I'm not angry, just stunned." Relief washed over his features. He squeezed her hand. "Thank you." The steward returned briefly, leaving a main course of seared fish and vegetables seasoned with aromatic herbs. Naomi and Alexander ate slowly, the weight of honesty settling between them. At times they drifted into light chatter, her sister's tuition struggles, his experiences growing up in the shadow of an empire. Other times they lapsed into comfortable silence, letting the closeness speak for itself. Eventually, the steward removed the plates. Candlelight flickered against the dark glass of the window, revealing only the faint reflection of two figures leaning closer than before. Naomi could feel the warmth in her cheeks and the butterflies in her stomach intensify. Alexander rose, offering his hand. "Would you like to step closer to the view?" She followed him to the wide window. Though it showed only the black expanse of night and the glitter of distant stars, it felt intimate to stand there together. She tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "What happens now?" He brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "If I have my way, we'll figure that out together. My family's name, the pressure of it all. It's a lot, but I've realized I can't keep living my life in fragments, always 1 foot in, 1 foot out." Naomi's heart thudded. She recalled her own sense of responsibility, the urgent need to earn money, to help her sister, to stay grounded. Yet in this moment, with his fingers softly tracing circles against her arm, she couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward him. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force, their lips met. This time, it wasn't rushed or frantic. It was full of pent-up longing and unspoken promise. She felt the weight of his confession in every quiet breath, the sincerity of his desire to share more than a fleeting connection. The kiss deepened, tender and searching, and Naomi found herself melting into his warmth. They eventually broke apart, gazing at each other in the dim light. Alexander's voice came out husky. "Stay with me tonight." Her pulse fluttered. For all the tension and half-formed words, it felt so natural to say yes. She took a moment to breathe, ignoring the swirl of doubts about whether she was moving too quickly. The sincerity in his eyes reassured her. "I'll stay," she whispered. They drifted out of the private dining room, hand in hand, winding their way through quiet corridors until they reached a luxurious suite. She entered hesitantly, noticing the refined touches, soft carpeting, tasteful artwork, an expansive view of the ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows. It felt like stepping into another world, far removed from her modest cabin. Alexander turned on a small lamp, bathing the space in a gentle glow. He guided her further inside, then closed the door. The hush that fell over them was laced with anticipation. Her breath hitched when he drew her into his arms, pressing his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice a hushed murmur. She nodded, eyes shining. "I am." The hours that followed blurred into an intense shared warmth, a surprising depth of closeness. Naomi felt safe in his embrace, as though for that stretch of time, the outside world didn't exist. She didn't think about the mechanical malfunctions, the debts, or the uncertainties. Nothing mattered beyond the two of them and the quiet surrender to what they were becoming. Eventually, dawn's pale light broke through the windows, casting a delicate glow across the suite. She stirred, blinking against the soft radiance. Alexander was still beside her, breathing steadily, his arm draped around her waist. A pang of vulnerability clutched at her chest. Morning often brought reality crashing back. How would they navigate the gulf between his life and hers? Gently, she slipped out of bed, not wanting to wake him. The plush carpeting muffled her steps as she searched for her clothes, neatly folded on a nearby chair. While collecting her belongings, she caught sight of Alexander's jacket, draped over another seat. Her gaze landed on something peeking from the inside pocket, a black leather card case. Curious, she stepped closer. Part of her felt like she was trespassing, but a stronger part felt compelled to understand the man she'd just spent the night with. Carefully, she opened the case. Tucked inside was a VIP identification card embossed in silver lettering, A. Whitfield, Whitfield Cruises. Underneath the name was a small emblem matching the ship's logo. Her heart pounded at this unmistakable proof of his status. She'd known the truth after last night's confession, but seeing it spelled out in crisp lettering felt overwhelming. In that moment, she realized how truly powerful he was, beyond just the rumor of being someone important. This was real. A wave of mixed emotions crashed over her: awe, intimidation, and a flicker of fear about what it meant for them. Yet amid the swirl of feelings, she also felt a surge of determination. Whatever challenges might come, she at least knew the truth now. From the bed, she heard Alexander stirring. Closing the card case, she placed it back exactly where she found it. Her heart still hammered, but she forced a composed expression on her face as she turned to see him rising, sleep still softening his features. He offered her a tender smile, reaching out a hand as if inviting her back. She hesitated briefly, forcing herself to push down the anxious questions. For now, she would let herself believe they might find a way through the complexities of their separate worlds. Still, the memory of that VIP card glimmered in her mind, a constant reminder that the man she'd fallen for was no ordinary figure. He was Alexander Whitfield, heir to an entire empire at sea, and she was just Naomi, a nurse desperate to fix her life back on shore. As Naomi carefully puts the VIP card back into Alexander's jacket, she reads the name Alexander Whitfield Cruises engraved in silver letters, confirming he's far more than just another passenger. Naomi paced the small living room of her cramped apartment, feeling more restless with every passing minute. Outside the window, the midday sun baked the sidewalk, and a faint breeze rustled the leaves of a sickly tree down the block. She was home now, landlocked and far from the broad decks and midnight ocean vistas she'd grown used to on the cruise, but she felt none of the comfort she was supposed to feel in familiar surroundings. Back on the ship, she had dreamed that once she returned, she would deal with her unpaid bills and her sister's tuition worries with the money she earned. But now that she held her paycheck, it seemed woefully insufficient against the looming debts stacked on her kitchen counter. She glanced at those envelopes, most of them featuring warnings stamped in red, and felt her stomach knot. Even the small luxuries, a steady internet connection, a decent meal, felt uncertain. She was falling behind no matter how fast she ran. Her sister Mabel had left for an afternoon shift at a nearby diner, part of a desperate attempt to stave off more college bills. Naomi felt a stab of guilt, wishing she could shield her sibling from these worries. But no matter how she twisted her thoughts, the weight of responsibility clung, heavier by the day. The phone on the rickety side table buzzed, making her jump. She lunged for it, half hoping, half fearing it might be Alexander. In the week since she'd disembarked the cruise, she had called the number he'd given her countless times. Each attempt led only to polite, roundabout answers from some unknown assistant, or to a recorded message claiming the line was temporarily unavailable. She'd tried leaving voicemails, trying to sound casual, then urgent, then calmly insistent. None were returned. Bracing herself, Naomi checked the screen. It was only an automated bill reminder. She dropped the phone onto the couch with a low groan. The impulse to throw it against the wall flickered through her, but she clenched her fists and forced herself to breathe. Losing her temper wouldn't fix anything. Trying to soothe her nerves, she walked to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed cool water on her face. Then, as she straightened to examine her reflection in the mirror, a wave of nausea swelled, and she barely had time to reach the toilet before retching. Her chest heaved with silent sobs as she shakily rose to wash her mouth out. The possibility she had tried to ignore for several days now could no longer be brushed aside. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, heart pounding. The repeated bouts of queasiness, the sudden aversions to smells she used to tolerate. Too many signs pointed in one direction. Naomi had been a nurse long enough to recognize what they meant. With trembling hands, she reached into the medicine cabinet, where a small pregnancy test lay hidden behind bottles of toothpaste and lotion. She'd bought it 3 nights ago, too scared to use it. Now, the moment of truth had arrived. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and followed the instructions on the box. Time stretched painfully as she waited for the result. The seconds on her phone's timer ticked by at a snail's pace. Each beep sent her stomach into tighter knots. At last, the final beep sounded. She forced herself to look. A single definitive symbol materialized. Positive. Her heart thundered and her vision blurred momentarily as a dizzying combination of fear, awe, and wonder flooded her mind. She was pregnant, carrying Alexander's child. A tear slid down her cheek, not wholly out of sadness or joy, but from the sheer weight of it all. She pressed a hand gently over her lower belly, feeling more aware than ever of her body and its changes. Thoughts of Alexander came rushing back. On the cruise, they had been swept away by emotion, by the thrill of unexpected closeness. She recalled their conversations, the passionate moments, and the warmth of his arms. Now she felt a profound ache. He needed to know. Whatever the future held for them, he had a right to be part of this life they'd created together. But how to reach him when every attempt so far had failed? She spent the next half hour pacing the apartment, phone in hand, trying the number again. Voicemail, another attempt, voicemail again. In mounting desperation, she left messages that carefully skirted the full truth. She wanted to talk in person. She had something urgent to discuss. Please call her back. Yet each time the automated recording cut her off, and she was left with a sinking feeling. What if he was ignoring her? Or what if his staff simply refused to pass along her messages? Despite her nerves, she finally turned on the TV to catch the evening news. She needed some distraction, or perhaps a stroke of luck. Maybe there would be some mention of Whitfield cruises, or an update on new ship expansions. Her heart leapt into her throat when, sure enough, a segment introduced Alexander Whitfield himself. The young heir to the Whitfield empire stood at a polished podium, flanked by corporate executives. He wore a sharp suit and a practiced smile. Cameras flashed and reporters' microphones jostled for space. While the anchor explained that Alexander was announcing a philanthropic initiative in partnership with coastal cleanup organizations, Naomi's gaze locked onto his image. He looked every inch the poised businessman, confident and distant, a far cry from the man who had stolen quiet moments with her under starlit decks. Her fingers clenched around the remote. She couldn't tear her eyes away. At last, the broadcast moved on. She turned the TV off, her heart pounding. She had seen him, alive, well, and seemingly oblivious to the fact that she was carrying his child. Could it be that he genuinely didn't know? Or had he found out and decided to cut her off? Her mind swirled with confusion. It took her another 2 days of inner debate before she decided to take decisive action. She discovered the address of the Whitfield Cruises corporate headquarters online, a sleek building in the city's financial district. Determined to give him the news face-to-face, she collected her most professional outfit, an older blazer and matching skirt, slightly worn but clean, and brushed her hair into a neat ponytail. Early the next morning, she caught a bus downtown, clutching a folder containing her ultrasound appointment papers, her identity documents, and anything else that might prove she was serious. The mirrored skyscrapers downtown soared above her, reflecting clouds and sunlight in their glass facades. Whitfield Tower dominated the block, its emblem shimmering near the top floors. Naomi swallowed hard, stepping into the modern lobby. The hush of polished marble floors and towering columns pressed on her nerves. People in tailored suits hurried around, murmuring into earpieces or scanning tablets. She felt like a misplaced puzzle piece, an ordinary woman in a world of polished professionals. She approached the reception desk, forcing a polite smile even though her nerves threatened to choke her. "Hello, I'm here to see Alexander Whitfield," she said, keeping her voice calm. The young receptionist studied her with a bland, polite expression. Do you have an appointment? I don't, but it's urgent. Naomi's voice wavered just a fraction. If you could just tell him Naomi is here. Naomi, from the cruise. Without responding, the receptionist tapped through a digital system. Then she made a phone call, speaking in low, professional tones. Naomi tried to overhear but could only catch phrases like, an unscheduled visitor, and no record of an appointment. Several tense minutes later, a stone-faced man in a tailored suit approached. Ms. Naomi? He asked briskly, pronouncing her name with faint impatience. I'm one of Mr. Whitfield's associates. May I ask the nature of your visit? She swallowed, her palms clammy. I have an important personal matter to discuss with him. If he's available, it really can't wait. His expression remained unmoved. Mr. Whitfield is in a meeting and cannot be disturbed. Perhaps you'd like to leave a message? His tone made it clear this was a dismissal, not an invitation. Naomi felt anger flare. I've tried leaving messages. No one has gotten back to me. That's unfortunate, he replied smoothly. But we have protocols. Alexander, Mr. Whitfield, receives countless inquiries. If you'll kindly provide your details, we'll pass them along. If there's a reason to follow up, we will. She pressed her lips together. I need to speak to him in person. She nearly blurted out the whole truth, that she was pregnant, that she had proof. But something in the associate's icy stare made her hesitate. Instead, she lifted her chin. This is private. If he knew I was here, he'd see me. He remained unfazed. We appreciate your time, Ms. Naomi, but I'm afraid there's no way to accommodate you today. With a clipped motion, he gestured for security, and 2 uniformed guards appeared. Please escort her out, he said, and ensure we have her contact information should Mr. Whitfield's office need it. Humiliation burned in her cheeks as she was guided to the exit. The enormous glass doors slid open, revealing a gray, rain-soaked street. Outside, water splashed against the pavement, and a cold wind raked through her coat. She paused under the building's awning, refusing to let tears surface. She had come all this way only to be brushed off like a nuisance. Her mind whirled. Maybe Alexander really was in a meeting. Maybe he had no idea she was trying to reach him. Yet the flat refusal felt deliberate, as though people around him were instructed to block her out. She stared at the heavy clouds above, raindrops peppering the sidewalk at her feet, frustration thrumming through her veins. She gathered her resolve and stepped out into the downpour. Her shoes quickly soaked through, the cold water stinging her ankles. She pulled her blazer tighter around her shoulders, oblivious to the stares of passing strangers. The city felt hostile and unwelcoming, a place where individuals were swallowed up by towering glass giants. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She tugged it out, rain dribbling onto the screen and making it slippery. A random number flashed across it. She answered, pressing it close to hear over the din of traffic and falling rain. "Hello?" she ventured, voice shaking. A moment of static crackled in her ear, then a low, anonymous voice spoke. "Naomi, isn't it? You need to stop. You'll never get close to Mr. Whitfield again. It's best if you give up now." Her heart lurched. She froze there on the sidewalk, rain trailing down her face like tears. "Who is this?" she asked, but the line went dead. She pulled the phone away, staring at the screen. Her hands trembled. The message was chilling, but something in Naomi's spirit defied the intimidation. She wouldn't walk away without giving Alexander the truth, no matter how many obstacles blocked her path. Rain continued to pour, soaking her hair, running in rivulets down her cheeks. She pressed the phone to her chest, letting out a shaky breath. A slow, determined resolve hardened within her. If Alexander's circle thought they could scare her off, they were wrong. She had a baby to think of now, their baby, and she refused to let it grow up without giving the father a chance to know the truth, even if it meant tearing down every barrier around him, one by one. As she left the tall glass building in the driving rain, an unknown caller warned her to stay away from Alexander, insisting she'd never be able to see him again. Naomi ended the call with her heart pounding. more determined than ever not to give up. Naomi shuffled down the narrow hallway of her apartment building, one hand pressed to her lower back. The tension in her muscles felt worse every day, partly from anxiety and partly from the growing weight of the tiny life she carried inside her. Each step brought a dull ache that reminded her just how fragile her situation had become. Outside, the sun was setting behind thick gray clouds, leaving the corridor murky with half light. She pushed open her front door and flicked on the overhead bulb. A single lamp buzzed slightly, casting a dim glow across worn furniture. She set her shoulder bag on the kitchenette counter and exhaled shakily. The conversation with Alexander's lawyers earlier that day still echoed in her mind. Sharp words and cold stares. They'd made it very clear that she was not welcome anywhere near him or his corporate empire. All of her attempts to communicate the simple truth, she needed Alexander to know she was pregnant, fell on deaf ears. They treated her like a nuisance, or worse, a liar trying to extort money. A quiet knock rattled the thin wood of her front door. Naomi felt a spark of dread. She hesitated, heart pounding, certain it was more unwelcome news. Lately, each day brought a new challenge: threatening letters, overdue bills, condescending phone calls from anonymous men claiming they spoke on Alexander's behalf. Steeling herself, she crossed the short distance and eased the door open. To her relief, she found Mrs. Martha standing there, a gentle smile lifting the older woman's cheeks. Naomi's breath caught. She hadn't seen Mrs. Martha since the cruise ended, though they'd exchanged a few friendly calls. Sensing Naomi's troubles, the older woman had insisted on paying her a visit. Naomi beckoned her inside. Mrs. Martha stepped in, glancing around the modest apartment. Her gaze swept from the faded wallpaper to the stack of bills on the coffee table. "My dear," she said, her voice laced with concern, "you look exhausted." Naomi forced a faint smile and led her guest to a worn couch. "It's been difficult. I'm sorry for the mess." Mrs. Martha gently patted Naomi's hand once they sat down. "No apologies. I came to see how you're doing, and to find out if there's any way I can help." Naomi felt a rush of gratitude well up in her, followed by a pang of embarrassment that she was in this position at all. Her hands trembled as she gestured to the stack of envelopes. "The bills keep piling up, and then there's my sister's tuition. I thought the cruise job would give me a cushion, but it barely covered the bare minimum. And now—" She hesitated, placing a protective hand over her belly. "Well, now I have another responsibility." Her eyes flicked to Mrs. Martha's face, checking for judgment, but Martha's expression remained warm. "You're pregnant," she stated gently, as though she'd already suspected. "Does Alexander know?" Naomi swallowed, eyes stinging. "I tried to tell him. He never got my calls, or so they say. When I went to his office, I was told to leave. His lawyers, they treated me like I was lying or trying to blackmail him." Mrs. Martha made an indignant sound. "Those sharks! They don't know who they're dealing with. Alexander is not that kind of man, I'm sure of it." She paused, considering. "I have a friend, a retired cruise director who still has connections high up in the Whitfield line. Maybe he can help you get in touch with Alexander directly, bypassing those meddling lawyers." Naomi's eyes flickered with a faint spark of hope. She remembered how, on the ship, Mrs. Martha always seemed to know the right people and have the right words of advice. "That would mean the world to me," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "We'll figure it out, dear," Martha promised. "Your child deserves to have a father who knows they exist, and you deserve to be heard." Buoyed by the older woman's confidence, Naomi offered tea, though her cupboards held little beyond cheap packets and stale crackers. As she boiled water, she confided more of her recent struggles. Job rejections from local clinics, the humiliation she'd faced when attempting to speak with Alexander's staff, and the persistent calls from unidentified numbers warning her to give up. Each revelation made Marta's face darken with righteous anger. "They're bullying you into silence," Marta said, shaking her head. "I've seen it before. Powerful families sometimes go to extreme lengths to protect themselves from scandal. But you and I both know Alexander wouldn't condone that if he knew the truth. Naomi poured 2 mismatched cups of tea, her gaze dropping to the floor. Part of me worries he does know, and doesn't want anything to do with me. Mrs. Martha reached across the table, covering Naomi's hand with her own. From what I witnessed on that cruise, that man had genuine feelings for you. If you ask me, it's not him doing this. It's the people around him. They're protecting his reputation or the company's image, and they don't care about anyone who gets hurt in the process. Naomi clenched her hand around her teacup, releasing a shaky breath. She silently hoped Marta was right. She couldn't bear the alternative, that the tender moments she'd shared with Alexander had been nothing more than a fleeting affair in his eyes. The next day, Marta returned with a promise. Her friend had agreed to help arrange a meeting with someone influential, another retired executive who still had leverage within Whitfield Cruises. But the meeting wasn't for another week, and it wasn't guaranteed to reach Alexander directly. Naomi's heart squeezed with impatience, yet it was the best lead she had. As the days trudged on, her financial worries deepened. Landlords knocked on her door, demanding late rent. Her sister's college threatened to bar her from classes if tuition remained unpaid. The stress weighed heavily, and the pregnancy magnified her emotions. She battled waves of fatigue and bursts of nausea, sometimes wondering how she'd find the strength to keep fighting. In her few calm moments, Naomi tried to recall Alexander's face, how earnest he had looked when he spoke of wanting a life free from his family's manipulations. She clung to that memory like a lifeline, determined to believe he wouldn't abandon her. But each unanswered call ate away at her confidence. Occasionally, she entertained the possibility that he was deliberately ignoring her, choosing the safety of his empire over the reality of her condition. The thought left her hollow. One afternoon, a uniformed courier appeared at her door, delivering a manila envelope. A strange sense of dread clutched her as she signed for it. Once the courier left, she peeled it open. Inside, she found a cold, impersonal letter addressed to Ms. Naomi, typed on thick, expensive paper. "We understand you claim to have conceived a child with Mr. Alexander Whitfield. Our firm has been advised to resolve this matter promptly and discreetly. We are prepared to offer a settlement in exchange for your signed assurance of non-disclosure." The letter went on, referencing sums that made her eyes widen. They were offering a great deal of money, enough to clear her debts and stabilize her sister's tuition, enough to live comfortably for quite some time. But the conditions were stark. No future contact with Alexander, no claims on paternity, and a binding agreement to never reveal her relationship with him or the pregnancy. Naomi felt sick reading it. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the pages. Toward the end, she noticed the signature of a senior partner at an upscale law firm. There was no mention of Alexander's own name, no direct acknowledgement of fatherhood, just references to the alleged child. Anger and hurt swelled. They were trying to buy her silence, effectively banishing her and the baby from Alexander's life. She dropped the envelope to the floor, tears blurring her vision. If she took the money, she could solve her immediate problems. But how could she live with herself if she denied the baby a chance to know its father? Every fiber of her being rebelled at the idea of letting them sweep her under a rug as if she and the child were shameful secrets. Later that evening, Mrs. Martha visited again and found Naomi clutching the letter in trembling hands. Marta read it, her lips pressed into a tight line. "I can't believe they'd stoop this low," she seethed. "It's a bribe. They want you to vanish." Naomi nodded, wiping her eyes. "I won't do it. No matter how desperate I am, I won't sign that paper. I want my child to at least have the possibility of knowing their father. It's not just about money. He needs to hear this from me, face to face." Marta nodded firmly. "Then that's your decision. Good. No one should force you to sell your silence. But you must be prepared. They won't give up easily." True to Marta's warning, the next days grew even harder. Naomi received more anonymous calls, each urging her to accept the settlement for her own good. She refused to answer after the second time, letting them all go to voicemail. More eviction threats landed in her mailbox. Her sister anxiously waited to see if the financial nightmare would force her to drop out of school. Meanwhile, the pregnancy advanced, subtle changes in Naomi's body reminding her daily of the new life at stake. Yet a tiny flame of hope refused to die. The meeting Marta had arranged with the retired executive was drawing closer. Naomi prayed this man, rumored to be a personal friend of Alexander's late father, could help her deliver the news directly. Maybe then the truth would reach Alexander. Maybe then he would step in and put an end to the harassment from his own circle. On a chilly morning, with the wind howling outside her window, Naomi huddled in a threadbare sweater, her phone pressed to her ear. She spoke to the prospective contact, an older gentleman who confirmed that he would set up something soon, though he couldn't guarantee a direct audience with Alexander. Naomi tried to keep her voice steady, but her desperation bled through every word. She needed this. It was her last real chance to speak truth to him. When she ended the call, she stared at her phone, tears threatening. She was weary, exhausted from fighting a battle that seemed unwinnable. Part of her felt foolish for clinging to the hope that Alexander was blameless in all this, that he had no idea about her situation. Still, her instincts told her his lawyers were orchestrating it all, isolating him from her claims and spinning their own narrative. She wanted to believe that if Alexander knew the full story, he wouldn't abandon her. That evening she sat on her couch, reading the same letter from the law firm for the umpteenth time. The hush of the apartment pressed in on her. Mabel was still out, picking up an extra shift. Naomi felt the baby shift in her belly, a slight flutter that simultaneously frightened and comforted her. Taking a steadying breath, she reminded herself why she was fighting so hard. Just as she began drifting into a doze, drained by the day's stress, her phone chimed. She lifted it, heart pounding at the sight of an unfamiliar number. Her first instinct was to brace for more threats, but then she spotted Mrs. Martha's name in the text message preview. Relief flooded her. She tapped the screen. "I've spoken again with my contact. He arranged for you to meet someone who can get you closer to Alexander. The meeting is set for tomorrow, at a discreet location. I'll come by in the morning to help. Don't lose hope." A faint surge of adrenaline brought tears to Naomi's eyes. At last, an open door, however small. She whispered a shaky thank you to the still air. Her time was running out, and the baby was growing every day. But if tomorrow's meeting yielded even a narrow path toward reaching Alexander, she would take it without hesitation. Though Naomi is about to lose hope, Mrs. Martha's message promises that a contact can help her force a meeting with Alexander, an opportunity she refuses to let slip away. Naomi woke before dawn, too restless to sleep. The soft glow of the street lamps crept through the threadbare curtains in her living room, illuminating the small space she and her sister shared. She clutched her mug of tea, feeling its warmth seep into her trembling fingers. Today was the day she was supposed to meet the contact Mrs. Martha had arranged, someone who claimed they could finally bring her face to face with Alexander. After everything, she was too wary to put much faith in it, but it was her only lead. Her sister still slept in the bedroom. Naomi could hear her gentle breathing through the thin wall. These days, Mabel juggled her college classes and extra shifts at a local cafe, trying to keep them afloat. Naomi's heart twisted at the thought. She used to be the dependable older sister, the one Mabel could rely on. Now Naomi could barely cover her own expenses, let alone help with tuition. The baby she carried changed everything, not just her financial situation but her sense of responsibility and fear of the future. Yet it also fueled her determination. She couldn't give up. She drained the last sip of tea, dressed in her neatest outfit, a knee-length skirt and a modest blouse, and left a note for Mabel, explaining she had an early meeting and would be home later. Smoothing her hand over her small but growing baby bump, Naomi whispered a silent promise to keep fighting for both of them. The sun had just begun to rise when she arrived at the designated spot, a quiet cafe on a lesser-traveled side street. The building's exterior had once been painted a cheerful yellow, but time and weather had faded it to a dull cream. A few potted plants by the door sagged in the cool morning air. Naomi stepped inside, scanning the nearly empty space. A single waitress behind the counter offered her a polite nod, and a middle-aged man in a charcoal gray suit lifted his head. He was seated at a corner table, a briefcase resting by his feet. She recognized him from the photo Marta had shown her. Mr. Sequeira, a retired executive from Whitfield Cruises with rumored ties to the Whitfield family. Gathering her courage, Naomi approached. "Good morning," she said quietly. He rose and extended a hand, giving her a measured smile. "Naomi, correct? Please sit." His voice was low, his accent hinting at a life spent in upper echelons of business. Once she settled in, he offered her a menu. "Coffee? Tea?" She shook her head, too jittery for more caffeine. "Water would be fine." He signaled to the waitress, then folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Martha spoke highly of you. She told me your situation is delicate." "That's one way to put it," Naomi replied, forcing a small, humorless laugh. The waitress brought a glass of water, and Naomi cradled it in her hands. Mr. Sequeira looked around, ensuring no one else was within earshot. "I understand you wish to speak to Alexander Whitfield, that you carry his child. Is that correct?" Naomi swallowed. "Yes. I've tried to reach him through every official channel, but his lawyers blocked me at every turn. I need him to know the truth." He nodded, expression solemn. "I worked under Alexander's father for many years. Although I retired some time ago, I still have acquaintances in the company. When Marta told me your story, I was skeptical at first, but she vouched for you. I made a few calls, tried to reach Alexander directly. Unfortunately, that proved difficult." Her chest tightened. "Does that mean it's hopeless?" He raised a hand gently. "Not necessarily. An associate of mine agreed to arrange a meeting in a neutral location. However, Alexander might not be able to attend personally." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But at least you'll speak to someone with enough authority to inform him. Are you prepared for that?" Naomi exhaled, a mixture of relief and anxiety swirling through her. "Yes, of course," she said. "I just want him to hear me out, to hear that I'm pregnant with his baby. If he chooses not to be involved, I can't force him. But he deserves to know." Mr. Sequeira studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I respect your courage. They asked that I bring you to a private office this morning about 9 o'clock. No press, no fuss." She hesitated, wondering if this was another trick. But what choice did she have? "All right," she whispered. "I'm ready." They left the cafe together, stepping into a sedan driven by one of Mr. Sequeira's acquaintances. The drive was silent, punctuated only by Naomi's pounding heart. She watched the city roll by, familiar streets and towering corporate buildings that felt increasingly oppressive. In less than 15 minutes, they pulled up to a tall structure with dark-tinted windows, far from the glamorous Whitfield Tower downtown. Sequeira escorted her inside, past a silent lobby and up an elevator that hummed dully. At the 11th floor, they stepped out. A woman in a severe suit stood by the door, her expression unreadable. She nodded to Mr. Sequeira, then ushered Naomi into a conference room with frosted glass walls. Naomi's pulse kicked into high gear. She half expected Alexander to appear, but the room was empty, aside from a large oval table and several chairs. "Wait here," the suited woman said crisply, stepping out. Naomi glanced at Mr. Sequeira, who gave her a tense smile. "I'll be right outside. If you need anything, just call." He retreated, leaving her alone. Minutes crawled by, and the silence became almost suffocating. She wiped her clammy palms on her skirt, scanning the room. A faint hum came from an air conditioning vent overhead. Outside the glass walls, blurred silhouettes passed in the hallway, as if no one wanted to linger near her. At last, Two men in tailored suits entered. One carried a folder, the other a polished briefcase. Neither was Alexander. Her heart sank. I was told someone close to Alexander would meet me. They took seats across the table, ignoring her comment. The older of the two, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Ms. Naomi, my name is Caldwell. This is my colleague, Mr. Bowen. We're here to address your concerns." She stiffened. "If by concerns you mean my pregnancy, then yes. I want to talk directly to Alexander Whitfield." Caldwell's lips thinned. "Mr. Whitfield is a busy man. We represent his interests on sensitive matters. We understand you're claiming he fathered your child." He slid the folder across the table. "Please review these documents." Naomi stared at the folder, dread coiling in her stomach. "What are they?" Bowen spoke, his tone clipped. "An agreement that ensures mutual protection. We're prepared to offer you a very generous sum, similar to the one you received before, to settle this. In return, you will sign a non-disclosure clause and refrain from further contact with our client." Her cheeks burned. "You're trying to pay me off again. Didn't you hear that I refused your last offer?" Caldwell leaned back, unruffled. "This sum is significantly higher. We believe it should cover all your immediate needs, medical bills, housing, even your sister's tuition. In exchange, you relinquish any claim to Mr. Whitfield's time or property, now or in the future." Naomi's throat tightened, anger warring with despair. "I don't want his money. I want him to know about the baby. If he truly doesn't care, let him tell me that himself." A flicker of annoyance crossed Caldwell's face. "You are under the mistaken impression that Mr. Whitfield is unaware of this. He has been informed, and he wants you to have this settlement, no questions asked." She felt as though someone had punched her in the gut. Was it possible Alexander already knew that he had dismissed her and their child so easily? Her mind rebelled at the thought. "You're lying," she whispered. "Alexander wouldn't—" Bowen cut in. "You have no idea what Mr. Whitfield would or wouldn't do. You had a brief fling on a cruise, Ms. Naomi. Nothing more. Now, unless you'd prefer a legal battle, I suggest you consider our offer." Tears sprang to her eyes. She fought them back, refusing to break down in front of these men. "What about a paternity test? Doesn't Alexander want proof?" Caldwell slid a pen across the table. "We're not here to debate biology. We're here to finalize this matter. If you refuse, we'll proceed differently, perhaps challenging your claims in court, exposing your financial desperation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You risk a great deal by continuing to chase a man who clearly wants no part in this." A wave of nausea washed over her. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, overwhelmed by the sense that the walls were closing in. She had come here praying for a chance to speak her truth, only to encounter more accusations and intimidation. Alexander's family, or at least his legal team, had orchestrated everything to keep her at bay. Outside the glass wall, Naomi glimpsed Mr. Sequeira talking to the suited woman. Their conversation looked tense. She realized now that he must have been duped too, convinced there was a genuine meeting waiting for her when all they wanted was to corner her in another hush-money trap. She rose unsteadily, the weight of heartbreak crashing down. "I won't sign anything," she said, voice wavering. "If Alexander truly feels this way, he can say it to my face." Bowen's expression hardened, but Caldwell remained calm. "Then you leave us no choice. We'll do what's necessary to protect our client." His voice carried a quiet menace. "You might want to reconsider before it's too late." Naomi turned her back, tears burning behind her eyes. She rushed out of the conference room, ignoring their shouts of protest. She nearly bumped into Mr. Sequeira, who looked startled and dismayed at her distress. "Naomi? What happened?" She shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "It was a trick. They just wanted me to sign another settlement, to vanish. They claim Alexander already knows and wants nothing to do with me." Her voice choked. "I can't do this anymore." He looked stricken, at a loss for words. "I swear, I didn't know their true intentions. I'm so sorry." Naomi brushed past him, desperate to escape the claustrophobic corridors. She stumbled into the elevator, jabbing the button for the ground floor. As the doors slid shut, her reflection in the mirrored panel caught her attention. Eyes swollen with tears, posture slumped in defeat. She felt like she was losing a battle she never intended to fight. Outside, the sky was overcast, threatening rain. She stepped onto the sidewalk, gulping in the city's smog-tainted air. Her pulse thundered as she hurried away from the building, her mind replaying Caldwell's words, that Alexander already knew, that he wanted her to take the money and disappear. Could it be true? Had Alexander turned cold the moment he discovered her pregnancy? Maybe everything he said on the cruise was just a fleeting whim, a distraction from his corporate obligations. The thought hollowed her out. Was her memory of his warmth, his promises, all a beautiful lie? She reached a bus stop and leaned against the bench, ignoring the curious stares of a passing stranger. Rain began to patter on the pavement, light at first. She gazed down at her abdomen. The life inside her deserved better than this relentless uncertainty and hurt. Naomi felt her chest hitch with a sob she tried to swallow. Where was the man who had once held her so gently? A voice behind her made her jump. It was Mrs. Martha, panting as she ran to catch up. Somehow the older woman must have followed her. She placed a comforting hand on Naomi's shoulder. "My dear girl, don't give up. I'm sure Alexander has no idea how twisted this has become." Naomi's lips trembled. She shook her head, tears mingling with the raindrops. "You didn't hear what they said. They claim he wants nothing to do with me, that he already knows and told them to handle it." Her voice cracked. "It's all been for nothing. Maybe he really did choose his empire over us." Marta's eyes filled with sympathy and anger. "No, they're manipulating you. I can sense it. They're manipulating him too." Naomi cut her off, her voice dull with despair. "Or maybe they're not. Maybe it's time I faced reality and accepted that Alexander lied to me, that he never cared." She opened her mouth to say more, but the words withered in her throat. She felt utterly defeated. Rain soaked through her clothes, but she didn't move. If her tears still fell, she couldn't tell, lost in the downpour. A bus roared up to the stop, brakes squealing. Mrs. Martha ushered her onto it, pressing a few coins into the fare box. Naomi sank into a seat, water streaming off her hair. A raw ache hollowed out her chest. She didn't know how many stops passed, nor did she care. The city blurred into shapes of gray and black. Next to her, Marta tried to whisper words of hope, but Naomi barely heard. The relentless heartbreak and exhaustion closed in around her like a shroud. As the bus jostled through crowded streets, a bleak understanding settled over Naomi. She was alone in this fight. Every door to Alexander had slammed shut, and every rumor pointed to him willingly shutting her out. She placed a trembling hand over her belly, tears hot in her eyes. She would protect this child with everything she had, but she could no longer cling to the dream that Alexander might stand by her side. When she finally looked at Mrs. Martha, the older woman's expression was stricken. Naomi tried to force a reassuring smile, but failed. Her voice came out ragged. "Thank you for trying, but I'm done fighting against ghosts." Marta tried to respond, but the lump in her throat prevented any sound. The bus hissed to a stop near Naomi's apartment. Slowly, Naomi stood, stepping down into the rain-soaked street with heavy limbs. She felt a numbness creeping in, a grim acceptance that left no room for hope. Maybe the next steps would be to sign that hush agreement after all, or to vanish somewhere far from here. She didn't know yet. All she knew was that her heart could endure no more illusions. She leaves devastated, believing Alexander purposely wrote her off. End of part 3 with the feeling that all is lost. Naomi was certain she'd reached the end of her hope. After being stonewalled by lawyers and receiving silence from every number she tried to contact, She had begun to accept that Alexander's world was impenetrable. Though she still loved the memory of who he had been on the ship, she could no longer deny the harsh reality. It seemed he wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. Every door had slammed shut in her face, leaving her at a loss for how to move forward. So when Mrs. Martha called early one morning, urging Naomi to come downtown for a Whitfield Cruises corporate event, she couldn't help feeling skeptical. She curled on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, trying not to sound too broken. "Please, dear," Marta's voice pleaded over the crackling line. "Trust me on this. I've heard rumors that Alexander himself will be there. It's some major unveiling. You have to come." Naomi closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Marta, I'm tired. I can't keep chasing him if he doesn't want to be found." "I know you're tired," Marta said quietly. "But this might be the last chance. At least if you see him with your own eyes, you'll know for certain where he stands." There was a beat of silence before Naomi replied with a heavy sigh. She had no illusions left, but something in Marta's unwavering faith nudged her. "All right," she conceded, though her heart pounded with resignation more than hope. "I'll meet you there." The event venue was grand, a converted hotel ballroom with gold filigree framing the high ceilings and a red carpet leading to tall double doors. Through the arched entryway, Naomi glimpsed elegantly dressed guests mingling beneath glittering chandeliers. Her own outfit felt plain by comparison, a navy blue dress she'd worn once before on the cruise, now snug across her growing belly. She couldn't hide her pregnancy anymore. The gentle curve of her abdomen was visible for anyone who cared to look. Mrs. Martha greeted her with a worried smile. She wore a modest gray suit, her warm eyes scanning Naomi's face. "You're pale, dear. Are you sure you're up for this?" Naomi tried to straighten her shoulders. "I have to be." They stepped into the main hall, navigating past a swirl of well-heeled businessmen and society figures. Large banners across the far wall announced, "Whitfield Cruises, New Horizons Initiative." Naomi recognized the stylized logo that also appeared on the liners where she had once worked and where she had met Alexander. The memory caused her heart to twist painfully. Marta guided her to a corner near a marble pillar. It allowed a partial view of the stage, where a podium and rows of seats faced the audience. The hum of conversation vibrated through the air, punctuated by the clink of champagne glasses. Naomi scanned the crowd, but her nerves made everything blur. She wiped her damp palms on her dress. Suddenly, a hush swept across the room. Heads turned toward the stage as a tall figure ascended the steps. Naomi's breath caught. It was Alexander. He wore a dark suit, tailored to perfection, his posture exuding quiet confidence. Cameras flashed, capturing his every step. Yet, even at a distance, Naomi noticed the tension in his gaze. He looked more solemn than she remembered, as though weighed down by responsibilities. He approached the microphone. "Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As you know, Whitfield Cruises has long prided itself on combining luxury travel with a commitment to sustainability. Today, we're excited to unveil our latest venture." Naomi barely absorbed his words. She was too overwhelmed by the simple fact of seeing him again. The smooth timbre of his voice ignited a rush of conflicting emotions. Had he truly dismissed her? Was the man up there, addressing a sea of polished faces, the same person who had held her so tenderly on a moonlit deck? The speech concluded to polite applause. Alexander stepped aside, making way for a round of corporate announcements led by senior executives. Naomi glimpsed men in suits who resembled the ones she had encountered at that disastrous meeting, those who tried to bribe her into silence. Her stomach twisted at the memory. As the audience dispersed, Mrs. Martha nudged her. "Now's your moment. If you wait, he'll be whisked away by the crowd." Heart pounding, Naomi nodded. She maneuvered through clusters of murmuring guests, her eyes locked on Alexander. He was shaking hands with an elderly gentleman near the stage, nodding at some remark. Naomi felt each step as though she walked on unsteady ground. Her nerves threatened to overpower her, but she pushed forward. Just when she was only a few steps away, one of his associates spotted her. The man's eyes widened in recognition, and he hurried to intercept. "Excuse me, ma'am, this area is restricted," he said with forced politeness, blocking her path. Naomi's pulse hammered. She tried to sidestep, but the man stepped in front of her again. "I just want to talk to Alexander," she said, voice trembling. "He knows me." Behind him, Alexander must have heard his name. He glanced over, his gaze sweeping the cluster of people, and for a moment their eyes met. Recognition lit his features, followed by a flash of confusion. She watched as he murmured something to the elderly gentleman who nodded and moved away. Then Alexander walked toward them, brow furrowed. Naomi's breath seized. For the first time in months, they stood mere feet apart. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the associate, his voice calm yet edged. The man hesitated. "Sir, this lady—" Alexander lifted a hand to silence him, his stare fixed on Naomi's face, scanning her features as though searching for an explanation. She struggled to speak through the lump in her throat. He was so close now, his aftershave subtly drifting between them. Memories flooded her mind. Stolen kisses, midnight confessions, the way he once said her name as though it meant everything. "Alexander," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "I've been trying to reach you." An uncertain flicker crossed his expression. "Naomi, I heard you disappeared. No one knew where you went." A spark of disbelief lanced through her chest. "Disappeared?" she echoed. Her voice rose, fueled by pent-up frustration. "Your lawyers have been blocking me at every turn. They offered money to make me vanish." He blinked, color draining from his face. "Offered you money? I don't— Wait, what are you talking about?" The tension in the air drew the attention of nearby guests. Sensing an unfolding scene, a few stepped closer. Among them were the very executives Naomi recognized from her humiliating meeting. She saw how their faces tightened when they realized she was confronting Alexander. One of them, Caldwell, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitfield, it's best if we handle this matter in private." Alexander's gaze flicked between Naomi and Caldwell, confusion clear in his eyes. "What matter?" Naomi's composure cracked. Her voice trembled with anger and heartbreak. "You never got my messages. You never called. Did they not tell you I was pregnant with your child?" Her words reverberated in the hush that had fallen. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Alexander's face went taut with shock. A hush overshadowed the glimmer of camera flashes from startled onlookers who had begun to realize something dramatic was happening. His lips parted, but no sound emerged at first. He glanced at Caldwell and the other associates, who wore matching expressions of alarm. "Is this true?" Alexander asked, voice low and steeled with an undercurrent of anger. "Have you been intercepting her calls?" Caldwell cleared his throat, beads of sweat gathering on his temple. "Sir, we were only protecting the company's reputation. We believed it best to, contain the situation." "Contain the situation?" Alexander repeated, disbelief turning to anger. "Is that why you told me she'd disappeared? Why I had no word from her at all?" Tension crackled around them. A small crowd continued to gather. Naomi felt tears building. The raw intensity of the moment almost crushed her. She stepped closer, ignoring the disapproving stares. "I tried. I went to your office, called the numbers you gave me, everything. They said you knew and wanted nothing to do with me." Her voice trembled. "I couldn't believe you would lie, but no matter what I did, they shut me out." Alexander's expression twisted with fury. He turned on Caldwell, voice echoing in the now silent hall. "You made me believe she'd vanished. I had a search launched. My lawyers told me she refused all contact. They said she asked for money and then left the city." A wave of murmurs rippled through the guests, all eyes locked on the unfolding confrontation. Caldwell tried to maintain composure. "Mr. Whitfield, we had evidence that suggested—" "Evidence you fabricated!" Alexander snapped. "Enough lies!" The outburst left Caldwell sputtering. A hush of tension enveloped the area. No one dared interrupt. Naomi felt her heart pounding. In that moment, she saw how deeply Alexander had been deceived, and for the first time in months, she dared to hope that none of this had been his doing. Seemingly galvanized by the stares of the crowd, Alexander took a step back, inhaling sharply as though forcing himself to remain in control. Then he turned to Naomi, emotion brimming in his gaze. "You're pregnant, my child?" He nearly whispered it, his voice laced with awe and regret. She bit her lip to keep from sobbing. Slowly she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for confronting you like this, but I had no choice. They tried to pay me off, threatened me, told me to go away. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you to know." He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, pain etched into every line of his face. "Naomi, I'm sorry." Then, more firmly, he turned toward Caldwell and the others. "I want an explanation. Now." One of the associates, trying to salvage the situation, attempted a placating smile. "Mr. Whitfield, perhaps we could discuss this behind closed doors." "This is a private matter." Alexander cut him off, voice seething. "You made it a public one by your betrayal. You used my name to threaten her. You told me she'd run away. You fed me a lie so you could protect the company. Protect your own pockets is more like it." Camera phones were now raised discreetly in the gathering circle of onlookers, capturing every charged word. Mrs. Martha emerged from the side, tears shining in her eyes, and slipped her arm around Naomi in silent support. Alexander noticed and inclined his head in a grateful nod toward the older woman, as if recognizing she'd stayed by Naomi's side through the worst. Turning to Caldwell, Alexander's tone dropped ominously. "You're finished here. All of you. I'll be speaking with my personal legal team immediately, and I expect full resignations on my desk by tomorrow morning." A ripple of shock crossed their faces. Caldwell tried to protest, but the expressions of outraged guests and the presence of security staff now stepping forward made it clear he had no foothold left. The associates exchanged terrified glances before slowly retreating, leaving the stage to the rightful players. Alexander exhaled, letting the tension of confrontation ebb. Then he moved closer to Naomi, gaze roving over her tear-streaked cheeks. Gently, he reached out and laid a trembling hand on the curve of her stomach. She let out a shaky sob at the tenderness of his touch. "All this time," he murmured, voice thick with regret, "I thought you'd abandoned me. I couldn't understand why, but everything was a lie." He swallowed hard, his eyes searching hers. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I promise you." Naomi released a long breath, relief and disbelief tangling inside her. She wanted to believe him. Every fiber of her being yearned for it to be true. In a quiet rush, she wrapped her arms around him, letting the weight of exhaustion, fear, and heartbreak tumble from her shoulders. He held her close in front of everyone, disregarding the cameras and the whispers. The moment felt raw, unguarded, and very real. Several heartbeats passed before they drew apart. Alexander's face shone with determination. "We need to talk, privately," he said, his voice steady. "But first, I need to address something for the record. There are too many rumors flying around." She nodded, wiping her eyes. Together they turned to face the hushed crowd, many of whom had recorded or witnessed the entire drama. Clearing his throat, Alexander spoke with quiet authority. "I apologize to our guests for this public scene, but I've just discovered a grave injustice done to Ms. Naomi. She carries my child, and she has been misled and threatened by individuals in my own circle. This ends now. Going forward, I intend to ensure she and our baby receive all the support and respect they deserve." A flicker of uncertain applause rippled through the assembly as though they weren't sure how to respond. Yet the empathy in many eyes was clear. Naomi clasped Alexander's hand, trembling from head to toe. The truth was finally out, laid bare in the most public way possible. He looked down at her, eyes bright with emotion. "Stay by my side. I'm sorry for all the pain." She managed a nod, too choked up to speak. Then, gently leading her away from the crowd, Alexander sought a more private corner of the ballroom. Guards and staff parted to let them through. The surreal hush that followed felt like the calm after a thunderstorm. Once they reached a discreet alcove, he lifted her chin. "I won't let them hurt you again. Everything they did was behind my back. Please believe me." "I'm trying," Naomi whispered, voice unsteady. "It's been such a nightmare." He cupped her cheek. "I know, and I'm so sorry. We'll face it together now." The finality in his tone gave her the first real spark of hope she'd felt in ages. Though the future still loomed with uncertainty, his family, the gossip, the possibility of new challenges, Naomi clung to the belief that Alexander was truly on her side at last. The baby within her seemed to flutter as though sensing her relief. They exchanged a look that spoke of both heartbreak and possibility, then took a single step closer, united in a moment that had felt impossible just hours earlier. While the door closes, Alexander confronts his family in front of everyone, acknowledging Naomi as the mother of his child, finally revealing his true feelings and setting a course for their future. Naomi stood in the hospital corridor, her heart fluttering with a mix of nerves and relief. Through a large window, she could see the pale light of early morning touching the city skyline, shadows gradually lifting in the promise of a new day. She ran her palm over the gentle curve of her belly, marveling at how much had changed in the past few weeks. After months of dread and uncertainty, she finally felt glimmers of genuine peace. Down the hallway, a set of double doors swung open. Alexander emerged, carefully tucking a pen back into his suit pocket. He offered Naomi a small, hopeful smile as he approached. It was a different expression from the one he usually wore in his public persona. No polished mask of composure or guard of formality, just sincerity and quiet warmth. Naomi's pulse quickened. Even now, she couldn't quite believe the transformation that had swept over both their lives. He nodded toward the rooms behind him. "I've just finished signing a few more forms," he said gently, "to donate some updated equipment to the maternity ward, and I spoke with the lead doctor about offering additional resources for prenatal care. I want to make sure this hospital is better equipped to help people the way they helped you." Emotion welled in Naomi's chest. Ever since the day Alexander had confronted his own staff and declared in front of everyone that he would take responsibility for their child, he had been working non-stop. Not just to dismantle the network of manipulation that had kept them apart, but also to turn his family's wealth toward more compassionate ends. Where once he was unsure how to balance the demands of his empire with his own heart, now he seemed determined to pave a path that aligned with both. "That's wonderful," Naomi said softly, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You're doing so much good. They were so kind to me here, back when I worried I couldn't afford all the tests." Alexander tilted his head, eyes clouding with remembered anger. "No one should ever have to choose between proper care and financial ruin. It's something I plan to address in all the communities where Whitfield Cruises operates. My father built the empire, but I want to reshape it into something that genuinely supports people." She slipped her hand into his. "I'm proud of you," she murmured. His fingers tightened around hers, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. Together, they made their way outside, where a car waited to take them across town. The last remnants of dawn glimmered on the tall glass buildings, painting them in hues of pink and gold. Naomi marveled at how different this drive felt from the desperate rides of the past when she would leave some corporate office or law firm in tears. Now the tension in her shoulders was gone, replaced by a sense of hope. Her thoughts drifted to the swirl of headlines that had erupted after Alexander's public confrontation. Tabloids had seized on the story of the secret heir, the pregnancy kept under wraps, and the sudden fall of Alexander's top executives. For days, reporters hounded them, seeking sensational details. Yet Alexander stood firm, refusing to shy away. In one concise press conference, he confirmed that the entire fiasco had been orchestrated by those determined to protect the brand, and that Ms. Naomi had been an unwitting victim of their machinations. Then he quietly asked for privacy while he and Naomi worked things out. To Naomi's relief, public fascination died down soon after, leaving them to piece together their new reality without excessive intrusion. The car pulled up to a modest but well-kept building. Naomi recognized it as a community center in a neighborhood that had struggled financially for years. After stepping out, she followed Alexander through the entrance. Inside, staff bustled with excitement, and a table was set up with refreshments. A small group of older individuals, reminiscent of the friendly folks she once cared for on the cruise, stood chatting in a corner. Mrs. Martha waved them over from across the room. Naomi's face lit with a smile. She would always be grateful to the older woman who had helped her keep faith when everything seemed lost. Beside Marta was Anselmo, leaning on his silver-handled cane, grinning broadly despite the brace on his knee. The sight of them warmed Naomi's heart. These were the allies who had become dear friends. "You two are practically glowing," Mrs. Martha teased as they approached. "Must be the magic of reconciliation." Naomi blushed, but Alexander's hand found its way to the small of her back, steadying her. "It helps when you have people in your life who refuse to let you give up," he said, nodding gratefully to Marta. "And people who remind you that compassion isn't a weakness." Marta beamed. "Let's just say I always knew you two would find a way to the truth. Dishonesty never stands a chance against real connection." She patted Naomi's arm. "Speaking of truth, how's the little one doing today?" A tender smile curved Naomi's lips as she laid a hand on her stomach. "Very active, probably likes all the excitement." She bit back a soft laugh. "I can't wait until they get to meet everyone who helped make their arrival possible." Anselmo gave a mock huff. "We can't wait either, though you'd best hold off on naming the child after me. Anselmo Jr. is a tad old-fashioned," he joked, causing a ripple of laughter among them. A representative from the community center stepped forward, welcoming them warmly. Alexander had organized a small fundraising event to launch an outreach program that combined elderly care services with maternal health resources. The idea, inspired by Naomi's nursing background and the supportive friendships they'd built on the cruise, was to ensure that seniors and expecting mothers got the help they needed. The synergy of bridging two demographics, elders longing for companionship and mothers needing experienced care, sparked a wave of enthusiasm. As they mingled, Naomi felt a quiet awe at how life had come full circle. Not long ago, she had been a lonely nurse on a cruise, terrified of her future and suffocated by debt. Now she stood next to the man she loved, both of them committed to turning the adversity they had faced into something positive for others. It amazed her how quickly fortunes could shift when honesty and compassion guided the way. After the initial introductions and speeches concluded, people dispersed into smaller circles. Naomi found a moment to slip out onto the center's modest patio, craving a breath of fresh air. The afternoon sun shone brightly now, the sky a piercing blue overhead. A few potted plants lined the railing, and she rested her hands on the wooden banister. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Alexander approaching. He wore a thoughtful expression, that subtle crease between his brows that meant he was weighing something important. "Everything okay?" she asked gently, searching his face. He stepped closer, resting a hand over hers. "Yes," he said, though his voice held a trace of lingering uncertainty. "I was just thinking about the future, the baby, your career, my family. There's so much to balance." Naomi exhaled, hearing the unspoken question. "We can figure it out together," she replied. "I can keep working as a nurse, maybe in some part-time capacity until the baby's older. You don't have to face your family alone or that mountain of corporate obligations. We'll manage." His eyes flickered with a quiet gratitude. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to run my father's empire differently. I've already turned a lot of heads by firing half my legal team. Shareholders are complaining about the public scandal. Part of me worries about the toll it takes. On you, on our child." Naomi drew close, lifting a hand to gently brush against his cheek. "You have the power to shape Whitfield Cruises into something better. The old guard might resist, but you're not alone. Don't you see how many people here believe in what you're doing?" She gestured back toward the building's interior, where guests mingled, forging new bonds of community support. "You've started bridging the gap between corporate success and humanitarian care. That's worth any fight." His shoulders eased, and he let out a long breath. "You always manage to remind me why it's worth it," he murmured. "Naomi, you're going to make an incredible mother, you know, and I want to be worthy of the father you and our child deserve." Her throat tightened with emotion. "You already are," she whispered. "We've both been through the fire, but we came out stronger, and we did it together." The sincerity in her eyes seemed to melt away the last of his doubts. He leaned down, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he said softly. "I know it'll never be easy, but I'm ready." They stood there a moment, absorbing the warmth of the sun and the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. In the distance, a cluster of children ran across a small patch of lawn, their laughter a reminder that life kept blossoming despite hardships. Naomi felt her baby stir, a gentle nudge that seemed to echo the children's joy. Eventually, they rejoined the gathering, where Mrs. Martha was regaling a small circle with stories from the cruise. Anselmo chimed in with comedic details, making the group laugh. Naomi found herself answering curious questions about the pregnancy from a kindly woman who ran a childcare program. As she spoke, she noted Alexander stepping aside to field calls on his phone, likely dealing with the fallout of his new policies and the shakeup he'd caused. Yet every so often he caught Naomi's eye and gave her a reassuring smile. Her heart soared each time, buoyed by the knowledge that this time he wasn't hiding anything from her. An hour passed in a pleasant haze of conversation and heartfelt connections. Eventually, the formalities wound down and staff began cleaning up. Alexander insisted on staying to help, surprising some volunteers who recognized him as the wealthy heir, but found him down on one knee, collecting stray napkins and cups. Naomi laughed when he dropped a plastic plate, and the pair of them hurried to tidy it up before an older volunteer could rush in. The simplicity of the moment, two people who had once been worlds apart, working side by side, spoke volumes about how they'd grown. When the last banner was rolled up and the center staff began turning off lights, the group drifted outside. The setting sun threw long shadows across the pavement, painting the horizon in soft oranges and pinks. Standing near the curb, Mrs. Martha embraced Naomi, then Alexander. "I'm so proud of both of you," she said, her eyes shining. "You're proving that real love and respect can conquer a lot of ugliness." Naomi felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Marta merely patted her shoulder, then waved goodbye as she and Anselmo tottered off, leaving Alexander and Naomi quietly contemplating the final hush of evening. Alexander hailed a car, and they slid into the back seat. As the engine rumbled to life, Naomi looked at him, a soft smile curving her lips. "So," she said, voice low with anticipation, "we take this day by day?" He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Day by day, and with every resource we have to ensure our child and every other person we can help never faces what you did. It won't be simple, but I've learned that the best things in life rarely are." Naomi rested her head on his shoulder, letting her eyes drift shut for a moment. She felt the car merge into traffic, the city lights beginning to flicker on. There was an uncertain road ahead, with all the responsibilities of fatherhood, corporate restructuring, and bridging two lives that had once seemed destined to remain apart. But the love they'd found on that cruise, and rekindled amid the chaos, guided them forward. The baby kicked gently, and Naomi couldn't help smiling. She placed Alexander's hand on her stomach, and he grinned in amazement at the new flutter of life. The quiet unity of that moment encapsulated everything they'd fought for: trust, honesty, and the promise of a brighter future they would shape side by side. By the time they reached her apartment building, the sun had fully slipped beneath the skyline. A tranquil hush settled over the street. Alexander walked her to the door, his hand still laced with hers. They exchanged one more kiss under the faint glow of a street lamp. She was certain it wouldn't be their last embrace tonight. After all, he was part of her life now, truly, without secrets or barriers. The baby they awaited symbolized a new chapter, uncharted territory they would navigate together. Before he stepped back into the car that would take him to another round of late-night calls and urgent planning, he turned, a contemplative look in his eyes. "Naomi, I've been thinking, after the baby's born, would you be interested in overseeing a new nursing clinic on one of the ships? We could offer you full creative control, design a program for passengers who need medical help on board, or even bring in training for young nurses. Whatever you want. I think the fleet could really benefit from your compassion and expertise." Naomi's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. She squeezed his hand. "I'd love that," she breathed, her voice brimming with the excitement of a new dream. "Yes, let's do it." He smiled, relief and admiration glowing on his face. "We'll talk details soon, I promise." With that, he bid her good night, climbing into the car that would whisk him away. As the taillights vanished into the night, Naomi let out a sigh, pressing a hand to her belly. "Who'd have thought this was where we'd end up?" she whispered to the little life stirring within. "From a chance meeting on a cruise to almost losing everything, now we have a real chance at happiness." She turned to unlock her front door, and as she stepped inside, the familiar comfort of the small apartment enveloped her. The future was vast and uncertain, but she had found someone willing to traverse it with her. The big challenges, financial woes, corporate battles, family approval, still loomed, but she no longer faced them alone. Some oceans are too vast to sail alone, but together, Naomi and Alexander discovered that no sea is insurmountable. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen